a picture, and it'll take you to the bios of our esteemed speakers and panelists who will be introduced throughout this program. We're also to be joined today by a number of elected officials, a couple of my former colleagues in the state Senate, Nick Collins and Mike Brady. We almost had a quorum of the Boston City Council during breakfast with the president at Flynn, Frank Baker, Liz Breeden, who is originally from Northern Ireland, and Michael Flaherty. Finally, we have an incredibly special relationship with UMass. Being as we are on the UMass campus and in countless other ways. And for that reason, we are so grateful to the president of the UMass system, former U.S. Congressman Marty Meehan, who is with us today. So if we could have a round of applause for all of our elected officials and special guests. As you can imagine, this event being held in this location, I couldn't come up with a more fitting spot. I know that Senator Kennedy would have simply relished being here to mark this occasion. His connection and commitment and that of the rest of the Kennedy family to the island of Ireland was unwavering. And during his time as senator, he was admired for his subtle yet significant interventions on matters related to Northern Ireland. And as we reflect on the events that ultimately led to the signing of the Belfast Agreement, often called the Good Friday Agreement, including the courage and the trust required by all parties in Northern Ireland, by the governments of Ireland, Britain, and the United States. We have a program that includes leaders from each of those areas on panels today. And as we look to the future, we know the vital role that economic development will play, and that is why we're grateful to the business leaders participating today as well. Now, the person who seems to appropriately exemplify everything I just said is United States Special Envoy to Northern Ireland for Economic Affairs, Joseph Kennedy III. He has dedicated his career to public service, including as a U.S. Congressman here in Massachusetts. In a short period, he has demonstrated his adept abilities in advancing economic development and investment opportunities in Northern Ireland to the benefit of all communities, as well as strengthening ties between the United States and Northern Ireland. Mr. Special Envoy, Congressman, Kennedy Institute board member, over to you. Welcome.
Adam, thank you so much for the incredibly kind introduction, for letting me steal your seat there for a little while as well. And for your extraordinary work here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. We are so thrilled and candidly, Adam, grateful to have you. What you have done in your brief time here at the helm has been extraordinary in terms of the platform that you have broadened for this institute, the programs that you have brought in, your ingenuity and your dedication. We are so grateful to have you leading the way here. And it is an incredible honor for me to welcome everybody into this very special place. It's obviously near and dear to the heart of my family, and I just have to say personally, there's no place I'd rather be than with all of you at the floor of the United States Senate. One way or another, we got there. Before going any further, though, everybody, I do want to take a quick second and recognize the passing of a champion on Irish-American issues in Joe Leary, who dedicated his life to peace and prosperity for the island. Joe spent 30 years running the Irish-American Partnership, raising millions of dollars to fund economic and educational programs dedicated to benefiting all communities. He stood up for reconciliation and put money behind it as an early investor in a peace dividend. I'm grateful for him, his work, and our thoughts and prayers are with his family in a difficult time. I also want to thank all of the people that came from so far away to be here with us this morning, the panelists and moderators and contributors to today's program. Today's lineup includes a number of dear friends, mentors, and candidly, it is a thrill for me always, and I learned this I'd like to say the hard way, but I probably as quickly as you all did, that it's always better to follow Senator Mitchell in a speaking program, or to precede him than follow him in a program. So, Senator, I know he's on his way here, but we are so blessed and grateful to have him in our presence today. Chairman Neal, a mentor of mine, New England Council President Jim Brett, who I perpetually in Jim's warm-up act, so grateful to see that continuing as well. Professor Megan O'Sullivan, who has been an extraordinary friend and wealth of knowledge on these issues on conflict and post-conflict, and so many others. Professor, wonderful to be with you too. And so many business and political leaders from around the country and around the world that are here today, trying to find, and in fact discovering, new pathways towards lifting the lives of all people in Northern Ireland. One of the reasons why I love this place is its setting by the water, right next to the Kennedy Library. Boston Harbor, just beyond Dorchester Bay, reminds us all of how this city grew from a religious outpost in the wilderness to one of the most thriving polyglot economies and societies, fed by an energy and imagination of new arrivals. In the wake of the Great Hunger, coffin ships from Ireland sailed across the Atlantic to this harbor, docking in the wharves of Boston, paces away from Faneuil Hall, across the harbor in East Boston. Patrick Kennedy and his future wife, Bridget, were among the thousands and thousands of poor Irish Catholics who disembarked in Maverick Square to forge a new life and a new homeland. The young couple represented Ireland's most precious resource and its most valuable export, its people. They were preceded by earlier waves of Scots-Irish from the plantations of Ulster, many of whom fought for our liberty, signed the Declaration of Independence, and led the push westward across the Alleghenies and down through Appalachia. Patrick was a cooper who fashioned barrels to fill the hulls of clipper ships sailing around the world. He died young. It was Bridget who somehow held the young family together, raising 4 children and running a store on Border Street. Without Bridget, there would be no Kennedy family story. And that way, our family history, our family story is not unique. It's a story of a family, of a community pulling together rather than being drawn apart. For no political, economic, or social advancement was possible for penniless immigrants without communities coming together to forge powerful coalitions that demanded change, for opening up jobs and classrooms and opportunities for everyone. We gather today much in that same spirit, 25 years after the signing of a Belfast Good Friday Agreement, to ask the question, what do the next 25 years hold? I am convinced it is a future of peace and prosperity, where the enormous effort put forth by generations of those who fought for their communities, dedicated to their people, will be built upon for a future informed by the past, yet not mired in it. For a generation of peace babies that one day will just be babies. Children who grow up to unite behind a vision of building one of Europe's most dynamic, energetic economies across sectarian, class, and political divisions that pull together, not drawn apart. Any society, including our own, is at its best when we follow that model. I was so honored to be asked to serve in this position by President Biden, to highlight those opportunities and double down on the bet that so many made for peace, those on both sides of the Atlantic, and of course, those on the island of Ireland. Business leaders from Boston like Ted Kelly from Liberty Mutual helped set that pace. A Belfast native, he recognized the advantages of a well-educated workforce, a strong entrepreneurial spirit, and a pent-up demand for challenge. And there is much to be impressed by. And one of my visits to Belfast, I rode on a boat that literally had a takeoff button and launched us in the air while moving on a hydrofoil across Belfast Harbor, which was once the center of a shipbuilding world. I walked through a factory floor in Seagate, in Derry, a factory that stood there for, or a company that's been there for over 30 years, trying in vain to act like I understood it when their engineers told me they were fixing lasers to atoms. I don't get it, but somehow and thankfully they do. Because 1/3 of all the computers in the world have parts coming out of that factory. 1/3. I met Oscar winners, virtual reality impresarios, butchers, clerks, tailors, hardworking stalwarts of an old economy, and vanguards of the new. More than 230 US companies are now doing business in Northern Ireland, employing close to 30,000 people. The United States is Northern Ireland's largest source for high-value foreign direct investment, predominantly in the technology, finance, and professional services sectors. And Northern Ireland has one of the highest, if not the highest, concentration of cybersecurity employment in all of Europe, primarily due to the status of the #1 location for global investment for US cybersecurity firms, which is an astonishing achievement. Life sciences there are thriving and have extensive connections with pioneering biotech firms incubated at the labs of MIT, Harvard, BU, the University of Massachusetts. All of this success is poised to grow with the implementation of the Windsor Framework, for which the UK and EU governments deserve enormous credit. It provides Northern Irish companies unfettered market access to 520 million people. If you're interested, I invite you to come see for yourself. President Biden asked me to lead a trade delegation in a couple weeks, and this is my biggest marketing ad I can get. So if you're curious about Belfast in late October, let me know. There's room for you. We look forward to being able to show off a side of Northern Ireland that many people don't see, and certainly folks in America don't often hear. We look forward to betting on the people of Northern Ireland and making US investment in their communities and help spread that peace dividend to areas that still have yet to see the full benefit of a Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And that is obviously a struggle, not just in Northern Ireland, but a struggle in communities everywhere, including here. Expanding economic opportunity and economic inclusivity to all aspects of our society. Northern Ireland is one of the few places on this planet where the connection between the past and the present is so tangible. But there's a difference between guided by that past and being held hostage to it. One can and should be proud to recognize the achievements that have been made while seeing that there's still a journey ahead. It's a balance that Northern Ireland wrestles with today. No, it has never been easy. Few experiences are as powerful as the acts of reconciliation and forgiveness by those who lived through the Troubles. During one of my visits to Belfast, I heard Patrick Keelty talk about the murder of his father by a loyalist gunman in his hometown in County Down. He said he sought the path to forgiveness, not for the sake of his father, but for the sake of his son. Because his father was the first Catholic murdered in his town, and he wanted to make sure that he would be the last. Patrick's story was recently told in a documentary series alongside that of Alan McBride, as he charts the path to coming to terms with the death of his wife in a bombing in Shankill Road. He blanches when he sees one of his wife's killers on the streets of Belfast, released from Long Kesh as part of a Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Yet, he was one of the 71% who voted for that agreement. McBride then spoke about visiting a classroom with largely Catholic secondary school students, where one of them said his story of pain meant little to them because, quote, no one is interested in hearing that story, that a younger generation has moved past that dark history. But the past, as William Faulkner said, is not dead, and it's not really even past. When McBride asked the Catholic audience to raise their hands if they'd ever moved to the Shankill Road, not a single hand went up. There is no progress to be made by ignoring our past or living numb to its present, nodding through, as so many did, an acceptable level of violence, whatever that may be. There came a time when enough was enough, and political will was created to put away the bomb and the gun. It is a legacy and responsibility that belongs not only to the generation that worked for peace and that voted for peace. It belongs to everyone. We know that Northern Ireland has wrestled through hundreds of years of division, tribe and tradition, country and creed, pain, hurt, and loss. People of goodwill and common purpose, from Dublin to Dallas, from Cork to Kansas City, and from Belfast to Boston, can help build a society where the troubles of the past give way to triumphs for tomorrow, where children can read about their history without reliving it. A young boy I met when I was in Belfast in April named Jack McBride. His teacher encouraged him to share a poem with me, which he carefully unfolded and read. It concludes, some still argue till this day if the agreement's truly sound. Is it the beginning of a new era or just a Band-Aid that's bound? Regardless of the criticisms, we can all agree that the Good Friday Agreement was a step towards harmony. So let's raise a pint of Guinness to the Irish and the Brits who put their differences aside for a future that uplifts. It is my hopeful answer to what happens over the next 25 years. A future deserved and earned that uplifts every child, every person across Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland. I am certain that you all agree. Thanks so much for being here this morning, and we look forward to a remarkable day. Adam, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We turn from the current special envoy to the original special envoy, George Mitchell. Senator Mitchell, yeah. Senator Mitchell is a dear friend to so many in this audience today, and he was appointed the inaugural special envoy for Northern Ireland by President Bill Clinton in 1995. He was, of course, the chair of the all-party talks that led to the signing of the agreement. Before that, he represented the great state of Maine in the United States Senate. Welcome home, Senator. And rising to majority leader. He was Chancellor of Queen's University, Belfast, the United States Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, among so many other critical roles in his storied career. We are incredibly grateful for your participation today. And standing as we are in the replica of the United States Senate, Senator, I yield the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adam, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence. it's quite moving for me to be in this location, which is such a good replica of where I spent 15 difficult years in the U.S. Senate. You're an easier bunch to deal with than those I spent my time with there. I want to welcome our distinguished guests who've come from across the Atlantic to participate in this conference. I'm sure that those of you present, those Americans present, will enjoy and be informed by their participation. I thank Adam and his staff for organizing this conference, which I'm sure will be very, very interesting. I'm especially pleased to be here today because of the location at the Edward Kennedy Institute. Ted Kennedy was a very dear friend of mine in our years together in the Senate. He was one of the most effective and productive legislators in modern American history. And so it's fitting that this beautiful replica has been built in his memory. It's also a pleasure for me to be here on the same program with Joe Kennedy, who is now doing terrific work as President Biden's representative in Northern Ireland. Over the past quarter century, there have been many documentary films, books, articles, news reports that have described the events that led to the Good Friday Agreement, also known as the Belfast Agreement. They have rightly praised many people for their efforts. It takes a lot of architects to construct a house of peace. I believe the greatest heroes were the people of Northern Ireland and their elected representatives. The people supported, they worked for, and they established a democratic, peaceful process as their preferred form of governance. They overwhelmingly rejected political violence as a way to resolve their differences. They're political leaders in the most difficult and dangerous of circumstances, at high personal risk and under tremendous political pressure, acted with courage, with vision, with strength. In the aftermath of the agreement, all were at some point criticized or rebuked. Some lost their public offices. Some of their political parties suffered steep declines. But they did what was right, and history will judge them favorably. The agreement was a political compromise, the best that could be achieved at that time. It did not purport to, nor did it resolve all of the outstanding issues. But it did accomplish important objectives, including, among many others, it ended the political violence. It made explicit the principle of consent, that the future political status of Northern Ireland is for the people of Northern Ireland to decide in a democratic process. It established a democratically elected power-sharing government. The agreement was reached and has largely been sustained because it was not imposed from above or from outside. On the very first day of the negotiations, I said to the delegates that I did not come with an American peace plan. I said there's no Clinton plan, there's no Mitchell plan, there's no American plan. If there is ever to be an agreement, it must be your agreement. And it was. The agreement was written and agreed by the elected representatives of the people of Northern Ireland and then approved by large majorities in referendums held in Northern Ireland and in Ireland. On the evening the agreement was reached, I praised the men and women who wrote and approved it. But I also said that it would take other leaders in the future to safeguard and extend their work. And so it has. It is now up to the current leaders of Northern Ireland, of the United Kingdom, of Ireland, to act with the same courage and vision as did their predecessors 25 years ago. In human affairs, the solution to every problem contains within it the seeds of a new problem. So the current leaders face updated versions of the same old problems that we dealt with 25 years ago, and new problems as well. But the current leaders can, and they must do whatever is necessary to preserve peace, to return self-government to Northern Ireland, to ensure for those they represent freedom and hope and opportunity. In June of 1996, after years of effort, the negotiations began. They were known as the all-party talks. I was asked by the UK and Irish governments to serve as the independent chairman of the talks. Serving with me were two outstanding statesmen, Harry Hokery, the former Prime Minister of Finland, and John de Chastelain, the former head of the Canadian Defense Forces. In elections in May of 1997, John Major was replaced as UK Prime Minister by Tony Blair. A month later, John Bruton was replaced as the Prime Minister of Ireland by Bertie Ahern. Blair and Ahern were outstanding, and they have rightly been honored for bringing the talks to a successful conclusion a year later. But credit also should go to John Major, to John Bruton, and before Bruton, to Albert Reynolds. They worked diligently to get the talks underway. These talks didn't begin on a moment. They were the product of decades, not just years, decades of effort by the two governments to organize and get them going. In effect, Blair and Ahern built the House of Peace on a foundation laid by Major, Bruton, and Reynolds. As to the talks themselves, as I've said many times before, we had 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. For almost all but the last 2 weeks of the nearly 2 years of the main negotiations, the discussions were highly negative and deeply repetitious. Early on, there were a lot of loud insults. There were several dramatic walkouts. I learned early that a standard practice in the politics of Northern Ireland is to stand up, denounce your opponent, throw all your papers on the floor with a loud thud, and walk out before the opponent can respond. That led me to make one of the most stupid statements I've ever made in a lifetime of stupid statements. I knew that they all like to talk, like all politicians, and also like all politicians, none of them like to listen to anybody else talk. So I said to the delegates, "You will be heard." I said, "If no one else is here, I'll be here to listen to what you have to say." At that time, I had this ridiculous fantasy that the talks were going to be over in 6 months. How I regretted making that statement. over 2 years, as the same people said the same thing over and over again, and I had to pretend to listen to them say it. So it was a very, very long and tough process. But gradually, before I entered the Senate, I'd served as a United States District Judge in Maine, and so I had some experience in trying to have an orderly process of resolving disputes. And gradually they became more orderly, but they remained unproductive. Just before Christmas of 1997, I convened the party leaders for a candid, off-the-record meeting. I told them what I thought was simple and logical, that it would not ever be possible to get a final agreement unless they could first agree on what were the issues to be resolved. I thought that was pretty basic stuff. They had been in negotiations for over a year and a half, and they still could not even agree on the wording of the issues to be resolved. So I presented to them a one-page typewritten document setting forth those issues as we, the chairman, saw them. At first, the discussion went well, and our hopes rose. Then suddenly, as so often happens in the politics of Northern Ireland, a single negative statement turned the entire meeting negative. The familiar insults and the disagreements resumed, and the meeting broke down in harsh acrimony. The next day, I left to fly back to my home in the U.S. for Christmas, deeply disappointed. And then it got worse. 2 days after Christmas, while in prison, a prominent unionist paramilitary leader was killed by a group of Republican prisoners. That touched off an escalating series of retaliatory killings that threatened not only to derail the talks, but to plunge the whole society back to the level of prior violence. The next 2 rounds of talks were held in London in January and in Dublin in February. My fears deepened as those talks did not deal with the issues at all and degenerated into each side blaming the other for the rising violence. 2 parties were temporarily expelled from the talks for being complicit with some of the violence, but they fortunately returned later. On the flight back to New York from Dublin, after that period of time, I became convinced that the only possible route to an agreement was to enter into an intense final round of negotiations with an early, unbreakable deadline. I talked with my fellow chairman who agreed. So when we returned to Belfast in March of 1998, we spent most of that month getting the 2 agreements, the 2 governments, and the 8 political parties still in the talks to agree on 2 weeks of final intense negotiations and an unbreakable deadline on the upcoming Easter weekend. Getting that agreement to have the final negotiations was almost as difficult as getting the agreement itself, because it required the unanimous consent of 2 governments and 8 political parties. And every time we made progress with 1 or 2, someone else wanted to change, and we had to go back to the beginning. So it took about a month to get them to agree to 2 weeks of talks. An unbreakable deadline was a very high risk, but we were convinced that all other alternatives were even worse. We set a specific target for each of the 14 days, but in fact, we didn't meet any of our targets until the very end. On the last day, Good Friday, April 10th, we distributed the final document. And I reminded the delegates orally and in writing of what I had said on the first day, that it was their agreement. Virtually every word in that agreement was written or spoken by someone from Northern Ireland. The Prime Ministers, Blair and Ahern, had personally and effectively led the final negotiations. They came to Belfast for the last week. So the governments were in agreement with the document that we submitted. The 8 parties went into caucus, where they debated the future of their homeland, of their communities, of their families. By late that afternoon, all had agreed. And so after we held a final meeting, it was extremely emotional, and it was over. These men and women of Northern Ireland, the political leaders, ordinary people, just like all of us, had spent their entire lives in conflict. Some of them had been shot, others had been shot at, some of them had committed criminal acts of violence, attempted murder, bombings, but they wanted to end the political violence, and they did. On that day, they rose to greatness. I'm often asked what means most to me from my experience in Northern Ireland. The answer is in a few numbers. According to the Northern Ireland Police Service and the Northern Ireland Statistics Agency, prior to 1998, in the approximately quarter century that has come to be known as the Troubles, about 3,500 people were killed in sectarian violence, and an estimated 50,000 were injured, many of them permanently and brutally maimed. In the quarter century since the agreement, the past 25 years, there have been a total of about 165 security-related deaths. These are powerful statistics, but don't think of them as numbers. Think of them as fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, whose lives were lost or brutally impaired. Over the past quarter century, I've come to know and love Northern Ireland, the people and the place. They are good people. They're trying to do what's right, even as they disagree on what is right. They're energetic, they're skilled, they're hardworking. It's true, they are very quick to take offense, and they have lots of internal differences. I was reminded of their attitudes, in fact, on the very first day of the talks, when one of the delegates, a great man named David Irvine, stood up in the back. It was a large room, there were then 10 political parties, 2 governments and a chairman, plus all staff, so there were probably 100 people in the room, probably about as many as in here. And he yelled from the back, "Senator, if you are to be of any use to us, there's one thing you must know." I said, "What is it?" He said, "We in Northern Ireland would drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult." Like you, I laughed. But as I looked around the room, none of the delegates were laughing. They are all nodding in agreement. They're very quick to take offense. And they have lots of internal problems and differences. But what society doesn't have problems or differences? The US, the UK, You can get on the list of countries. Nobody has a perfect political situation. And so I urge people not to judge Northern Ireland by a standard that no country in the world could ever meet. They deserve our continued friendship and our strong support, as do our friends and allies in Ireland and the United Kingdom. And I hope this conference and many others like it will contribute to that effort. Thank you very much, Adam, for inviting me today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Take care. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be in touch. Yeah.
I'm going to take your water with me.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Senator Mitchell. Incredibly educational and enlightening. I'll ask Lord Kane and Minister O'Brien and Professor O'Sullivan to come to the well here as I introduce our moderator. I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Megan O'Sullivan. Good to see you. Professor O'Sullivan is the director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Jean Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs. Professor O'Sullivan has served in multiple senior policymaking roles and has advised national security officials in both Republican and Democratic administrations. In 2013, she was the vice chair of the all-party talks in Northern Ireland. Professor, we are grateful for your presence, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the organization of this afternoon or this morning. Although he's left the building, I'd just like to take a moment to thank Senator Mitchell. I think we all feel what a privilege it is to have had him here this morning, to hear from him, to be in the same room. Although he very characteristically and appropriately said the thanks and the efforts of all involved in Northern Ireland deserve credit. I think we can agree that he is, in his own words, the primary architect of this House of Peace we talked about. He doesn't say he's the primary one, but he talked about the architects of this House of Peace. I'm sure some of you here were in Belfast at Queen's University for the anniversary of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement and heard Senator Mitchell talk. It was one of the most emotional things I've experienced. There was a standing ovation for him, which literally, I think, went on for 10 minutes. It went in waves. And it really was emblematic of the appreciation, the thankfulness, and even the love that the people of Northern Ireland have for Senator Mitchell. So it was really wonderful to hear from him. But now we also have a special treat to hear from two people who have come a long distance to speak with us here today. And we are going to talk a little bit about the past, but mostly about today and the future. And so sitting directly to my left, we have Lord Jonathan Kane, who is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary for Northern Ireland in the Northern Ireland office. He has advised 6 Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland. I know him from 10 years ago when I was vice chair of the all-party talks. It's a pleasure to see him again. And he was named to the House of Lords in 2016. And to his left, we have the pleasure of having Minister Dara O'Brien, who is the Irish Minister of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, a role that he has had since 2020. He's had multiple roles in elected office in Northern Ireland, currently a member of the Dáil for the second time, also had been a member of the Irish Senate. So it's a pleasure to have you here as well. So we have about a half hour or so. What I'd like to do is maybe get your reflections first on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, given that we're marking 25 years of that agreement. And then we'll switch gears and sort of look at, as I said, today and the future. So if I could ask each of you to give us your reflections on 25 years, but also your aspirations for the next 25 years. If we're here celebrating the 50th anniversary, what would you say? What are your hopes and aspirations for what might happen over the next 25 years? I think as has been clear in the comments of many people this morning, when we think about the past 25 years, we do so with both elation about the peace and the lack of violence that this agreement ushered in and has continued to sustain, but also in less measure, but certainly significantly, disappointment that it hasn't brought about reconciliation. So perhaps Lord Kane, I'll start with you, and then Minister O'Brien.
Megan, thank you very much indeed, and it's a great pleasure to see you again after a number of years. And it's a great privilege for me to be here and also to speak in the same session, even though he's now had to leave as Senator, I call him the great Senator George Mitchell, whose contribution to peace in Northern Ireland is beyond measure. I think the starting point, Megan, has always for us got to be unwavering support for what some people call the Belfast Agreement, others call the Good Friday Agreement. I've occasionally, to avoid controversy, referred to it as the 1998 Agreement. And for me and my government, we're in no doubt that it has been the absolute bedrock of everything that's been achieved in Northern Ireland over the past quarter of a century. And I often describe it, I say the great genius of the agreement really is its ability to accommodate difference, but in ways that allow us to work together. But I was conscious listening to George Mitchell earlier that the agreement didn't come out of nowhere. And as we mark the 25th anniversary of the agreement this year, we also in December would mark the 30th anniversary of another document that was agreed between London and Dublin, the Downing Street Declaration between John Major and Albert Reynolds, which helped to lead to the ceasefires. And it is worth reflecting in the run-up to that particular agreement or document, declaration, there was appalling violence. In October of 1993, just 2 months before, just under 30 people lost their lives to the security situation in Northern Ireland. You had the Shankill bombing, you had the Grey Steel massacre. It was an appalling time, so it just serves to, I think, remind us how far we've come in Northern Ireland and the great strides forward that have been taken. Megan, you're absolutely right, though, but for all the achievements and the successes, there are some great frustrations, and we are currently in one of those periods at the moment without a functioning, devolved government and assembly in Northern Ireland. The institutions are at the heart of the agreement, and without them, as I think George actually said at the 20th anniversary commemorations, without the institutions, they look pretty thin. So it is incredibly frustrating, just as it was when another party was holding the Assembly down in between 2017 and 2020. So our aspiration, our hope, has to be to get those institutions back up and running. As a government, we are working tirelessly towards that objective. We believe that the Windsor Framework, which Joe Kennedy very graciously referred to in his remarks, a great triumph for the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, we believe that the Windsor Framework does provide the basis for the restoration of the institutions. We're working with the DUP to try and clarify concerns that they might have without in any way renegotiating that agreement, which would be very, very difficult to do with the European Union. So I can't give a running commentary on those sorts. But my aspiration is very simply stated. It is to try and build a Northern Ireland where politics works, where the economy grows, where society is stronger and more united, a Northern Ireland that works for everybody. And I think that's what we can all unite behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. O'Brien.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And just to say, firstly, it's an absolute honour and a privilege to be here to listen to Senator Mitchell, who is held in such high regard, in this country, obviously, but in Ireland and indeed in Britain. And to hear him today and to be in this wonderful institute of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute and the input and the role that Senator Kennedy had as well, and that's been followed on by Special Envoy Kennedy. It's really, really special. So I'm delighted to be here on behalf of the Irish government to partake in this. I suppose I remember, as someone who wasn't involved in politics back in 1998, that morning of the agreement as if it were yesterday. And I say this as someone who grew up and represents Dublin. And the Lord Kane has mentioned the Downing Street Declaration, and that was actually a really important step forward in that regard, that the two governments, for the first time, I believe, in real terms, with the support of both parliaments, really respected the divergent views, the different views that the nations had, and respected the aspirations that Ireland and indeed that the United Kingdom had. And that led that forward. Like, for me, as someone who was always interested in politics, was to actually get involved in politics. The former Taoiseach Albert Reynolds, who was mentioned here by Senator Mitchell. I suppose the way I see it, that we've had 25 years, thankfully, that the vast majority of the children in the North, we've had a whole generation who aren't used to waking up every morning, listening to horrific news, watching that on the TV, or worse, seeing that on their streets. But there has been a lot of progress made in those 25 years around normalisation within the North, but also between Ireland and Britain. A relationship that all of you know that had been strained over the years from time to time. We've, centuries of history with each other. Not all of it good, but that we were able to move forward together through Prime Minister Blair and former Taoiseach Ahern. So it was a real opportunity. And for me, as a younger person, I see my good friend and colleague Colm Eastwood over there as well, that for the first time ever since 1919, we had a situation that the whole of Ireland, the island of Ireland, voting together on the one day, to actually people with all different views voting to affirm the work that was done by those very brave men and women led by Senator Mitchell in those negotiations. So a lot of progress has indeed been made, but I think it is also fair to say that the architecture that was put in place, the East-West, the North-South in particular, and I say that as an Irish minister and as a member of Parliament in Ireland, hasn't actually realised the potential that it can, and it still can, and I'm hopeful for that. But fundamentally within it, as a Democrat, it's so important that when people vote, and the people of the North voted, and that their mandate's respected and is exercised. And that means that 18 months on from the last election, that we've got to continue to work as hard as we can to ensure that the Assembly sits, that an executive is formed, that the North-South Ministerial Council meets. In my 3 years as minister, we've had very few of those meetings, if any, and they were stopped from time to time through various disagreements. But they're the practical things that actually are positive, or can bring positive change for the people on our islands, and particularly in the island of Ireland, because where I see this going into the future is to realise that potential, to work towards that shared island, that shared Ireland, and to further improve the relations between Ireland and Britain, whilst respecting everyone's rights and aspirations to hold their views and their views on how they want to move forward. But there is right now, as we know, certainly a frustration. There's a frustration on the ground, but that frustration shouldn't lead to despair. Senator Mitchell has rightly said it, that it's up to the next generation of leaders to move forward through this impasse. And the Irish government has been very patient in that regard and is working in the background to assist us to move through this impasse. But patience can't be infinite, and progress can't be held up by one party either. But we want to see that move forward. We want to work together. Where we've succeeded over the years is all working together. Different views, different standpoints, but all actually working together and moving together. And I am very hopeful that that can happen, so that in 25 years' time, that we have realised the economic benefits that Special Envoy Kennedy speaks about, but also the societal benefits that are the really important things, the communities coming together. In the Republic, I'll conclude on this, we have an incredibly diverse society now, completely different than it was 25 years ago. 30% of the people that I represent in my district weren't born in Ireland. There's a diversity on the island of Ireland that didn't exist. And that's the people from all different backgrounds who never, thankfully, knew the troubles, who never woke up in the morning listening to the radio about another atrocity. And that is our goal now, to really turn that frustration that's there into positive action and to move it forward, and I would say in an efficient way now, to get the democratic structures back in place so that our politicians, both in Britain, in the North and in the Republic of Ireland, can work together for the betterment of all of our people.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. I think it is certainly sensible that both of you raised the issue of bringing the institutions back to a functioning place as part of the aspirations, not just for the next 25 years, but the next 25 days or whatever the case may be, because certainly there's a thirst for having functioning institutions. And as you noted, that it's not just the power sharing executive in Belfast, it is also the other strands of the agreement that need to be fully functioning. I'd like to take us a little bit forward. I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing the Taoiseach at the UN Assembly or General Assembly Week in New York last week, and he mentioned not for the first time that patience to get these institutions back up and running couldn't be infinite. On other occasions, he alluded to the potential need for alternative arrangements or even a reference to a plan B. I pressed him on this a little bit, and he declined to give me any specifics, much to my regret. But I'm going to try with both of you. I think it was notable that Senator Mitchell mentioned that this agreement wasn't intended to solve every problem. And 25 years has passed, and there are outstanding issues, one of them being the frequency with which the executive has not been functioning. I think it's about 40% of the time since the agreement. And I wondered if I could ask just each of you, what are your views on this question of alternative arrangements? Is there a need for a reform of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? And if so, how might you envision that? I guess I'll go back and forth a little bit, but actually I'll start with Minister O'Brien and then come to
Yeah, I think firstly, like as has been said, and we have the foundations, we have the Good Friday Agreement. That's been affirmed and voted for by the people, and that should be our fundamental guiding objective, is to implement that to its fullest. Now, the Taoiseach is correct, the Minister for Foreign Affairs also, that their patience is not infinite, but we've always worked forward in a collegiate way. We've had many challenges over the 25 years that Senator Mitchell referred to as well. We've had challenges very recently, obviously, with the decision of Britain to leave the European Union. The European Union piece was central to the Good Friday Agreement as well, and we had to obviously change tack, respecting the vote of the people of Britain in a democratic way to decide to leave the European Union. But those type of things had to be surmounted. Those challenges had to be surmounted. So, the Belfast Agreement provides for review. But I think what our focus should be, to be honest with you, is to redouble our efforts now to get the institutions back up and running. But it is important, though, as well, that we scenario plan. That what happens if that does not happen? Like, how, in practical terms for people in the North, do we get a budget passed? How do we replace the Chief Constable? How on the North-South bodies, that one of which that I have the pleasure of sharing responsibility for, we can't appoint board members. Things that actually affect the island as a whole in relation to climate, biodiversity, infrastructure, all of the projects that we've been working on together very well. And even with, colleagues that would share very different political views than someone who grew up as a constitutional Irish Republican, and a constitutional Republican Party, that I was absolutely able to work well in the few opportunities that I got through engagement with counterparts in the North to move forward on issues together. And there's much more that we agree on. The issues that affect people around cost of living, around health, around infrastructure, around employment, are issues that all of us on the island, and indeed the two islands, share. But the fact that we're not able to deal with those issues to the potential that we can. We have a situation in Northern Ireland now that there will be A budget will need to be passed where we've no elected members to do so. We've issues with regard to infrastructure, health service. Not perfect in the Republic either, I might add, but at least we're there, we're accountable, we're in our budget preparations right now. But they're the things that matter to people on the ground. And I know my colleagues from the North will speak to that later of what that really means. But to answer your question, it's not about a plan B. I think we know that we can move this forward under the agreed infrastructure. But the Taoiseach is right, though, to highlight on behalf of the Irish government and many Irish people the frustration that is there, that we're not able to work together to our potential, but we can. And that is the thing, it is eminently doable. If we look at what's stopping us do that, in the overall context of one weighs up the issue, or the issues that are there that we can't put the institutions back in place, it's minor in relation to the problems that our people face and the challenges they face. So we're duty bound to move forward. And I would say move forward quickly. You mentioned 25 days. We have to move this on, and it has to be moved on.
Thank you. Lord Kane, how are your feelings about a plan B?
Well, I agree very much with my colleague that the real focus, the real drive has to be to restore the institutions. And just to reinforce a point actually made by both of you, it's always important to remember that this is a three-stranded agreement. So without the Assembly and the Executive sitting, Strand 2, the North-South institutions don't work as envisaged, and the East-West relations don't work as envisaged too. So it's always been a three-stranded agreement in which the strands are interlocking and dependent upon each other. So we are working, as I said in my earlier answer, very hard to bring that situation about. In the absence of the Executive and the Assembly, we've given civil servants some limited additional powers, but it's not a long-term solution, it's not a sustainable solution. To pick up your point, I had to take a budget bill through the House of Lords 2 weeks ago. We don't want to be doing these things in Westminster at all, but being realistic, despite our efforts, we might come to a stage where we have to say that this is looking unlikely in the near future and think about some alternatives, but it wouldn't be sensible to speculate as to quite what they would be at this stage. I think you posed a question about longer term reform, and we've always said that we are open to sensible suggestions for reform of the institutions, possibly to make them more robust, improve the way they work. You're right to highlight that they've been down for 40% of the time since 1999. And we've always been prepared to look at sensible measures, but I think where we'd all agree is that any reforms to the institutions would have to be consistent with the underlying principles of the agreement, which would be inclusivity, power sharing, and the need for cross-community consent.
Thank you. I have had the occasion twice to work on this issue, Northern Ireland, and the first one was more than 20 years ago, and I used to sort of joke with my then boss, who was then the special envoy, Richard Haas. We used to say, we look forward to the day when the politics in Northern Ireland will be boring. We're not there yet, so more than 20 years on, and as one of you mentioned, now is a period of a certain amount of difficulty, not only in the question of the institutions working, but in addressing a very poignant and often difficult issue in Northern Ireland, and that is the legacy of the past. And I'd like to start with you, Lord Kane. You've been perhaps the chief UK government leader in advancing the latest legislation now, a bill that has recently passed on the legacy issue. As we know in this room, this is a bill that's opposed by all the parties in Northern Ireland and by the Irish government and many in the United States as well. You've acknowledged this is a very difficult and challenging issue, but have talked about how you think the approach put forward in the bill is an appropriate way of addressing these very difficult issues that remain. So I wonder if you could just give us your perspective on the bill, why you believe this is an appropriate way forward, and what you might say to those who are opposed to this approach.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Megan, and I acknowledge yours and Richard's efforts 10 years ago to try and deal,
To make things boring.
with this very difficult subject and to make it boring, exactly. Where do I start? I mean, I could speak for the rest of the day on this subject, having done 80-something meetings on legacy and spent the past year grappling with it. And as you said, I'm the first one to acknowledge that this is a really difficult and challenging piece of legislation. I said that at second reading in the House of Lords last November. And it's very difficult and challenging for many people, and I include myself among that number. Very briefly, in June 1990, I was having lunch with somebody I worked quite closely with at the time, a Conservative MP for Eastbourne, and 5 weeks later, his body was blown to pieces in a car bomb. And as I said in the House, I'm not immune to the feelings of those who've lost dear friends and loved ones to violence in the Troubles. And so my approach to this was really to try, look at the legislation when it came from the House of Commons and see what, if any, improvements I could make. And I did pledge that I would go and speak to many groups about this and done 80-something meetings. I'll try and be brief. At its heart, what the government has tried to do here is make a realistic assessment of what it can reasonably deliver to victims and survivors and families 25 years after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, nearly 30 years after the ceasefires, and well over 50 years since the beginning of the Troubles, which it's a terribly soft term for a situation that led to 3,500 people being killed, but there we are. 50 years after the Troubles began, against a background in which the likelihood of prosecutions for events that took place 30, 40, 50 years ago is going to be vanishingly rare, and where the existing mechanisms, processes for looking at legacy really only work for a very, very small minority of the community. And the approach, therefore, is to try and set up a body which will be focused on information recovery and truth recovery, which will have access to all the files that the state holds, police, army, intelligence services, to piece together the facts of what happened in an individual case, then produce a family report that will be publicly available to try and establish, say, more of the facts, more of the truth, in a more timely manner to more of the families. Very quickly, and I'll finish here. The very controversial element of this is, of course, that in return for cooperation with the Commission, individuals, if they cooperate to a sufficient standard, which is judged by the Commission, will be able to apply for conditional immunity from for any of the offences in which they are implicated. I know this is difficult. What it isn't is a general amnesty. So a person would only be granted immunity in respect of a case that was under investigation. And the Commissioner for Investigations will have the full powers of a police constable to conduct an Article 2 compliant full police criminal investigation. But it wouldn't apply if somebody turned up and willfully misled the Commission, told lies, was subsequently found to have told lies, or refuses to cooperate. They will not be in that position of benefiting from the provisions. We've recently appointed Sir Declan Morgan, the former Lord Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, to head this commission. Peter Sheridan, who might be known to a number of you, the current Chief Executive of Corporation Ireland, the Peace Building and Reconciliation charity, but in a previous life a very senior police officer. So we're confident that the body, will be able to do its task. We'll get more information to families, as I say, in a context where the traditional criminal justice processes are very unlikely to deliver. But I can't stress enough, I'm under no illusions as to how challenging and difficult this is for many people, myself included, given my own personal experience. But I think if we don't do this, I suspect the chances of succeeding on legacy for any future government will be very, very limited indeed, and lots of families will still be waiting for answers that might never come.
Thank you. Minister O'Brien, could you give us your perspective, or the perspective of your government, about this legacy bill, and perhaps maybe touch on what some of the possible reactions that the Irish government might might take.
Sure. Firstly, Megan, to recognise the work that yourself and Dr. Haas did back in 2013 to bring us to Stormont House, which was, as far as the Irish government is concerned, the agreed way forward. Legacy, as I agree with Lord Kane, is the most sensitive of issues for people, and all of us, I'm sure my friends from the north will speak to that. We could all recount, I could too as well, instances within families in the south, people that I know, unfortunately, were caught up in the terrible events. So that's why it's so important that in this most sensitive of issues, that where we've managed to make progress through Good Friday is with the North, the British government, the Irish government actually working together on issues. I don't believe a unilateral approach will bear fruit, to be very honest. I think I understand and fully respect what Lord Kane has said with regard to the complexities of this and the bona fides maybe within. But I think we need to look back at what has been agreed. Yes, it's been difficult, and we haven't got there in the sense of people being able to get to the truth of many of those atrocities. But I would maybe ask the question is, what other unilateral approach was dealing with the relations between Ireland and Britain and Northern Ireland, Ireland and Britain, has actually borne fruit? And I'm not aware of any. So we are concerned as a government with the Legacy Act now. It has received royal assent, and both the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, who's our Minister for Foreign Affairs, who's spent a lot of time in the north and here in the States as well, has articulated those concerns. It is not our preferred way forward. The way forward has been agreed. I think we need to look at that. We need to also respect the views of the stakeholders in the north and in Northern Ireland. All the political parties oppose the approach. The victims groups oppose the approach. And I do fully respect what Lord Kane has said and the bona fides of trying to move this forward. But I don't believe that this will bear fruit by moving it forward, one government moving forward without the cooperation of indeed the other co-guarantor, which is the Irish government, and really importantly, the parties within the devolved assembly, which we know isn't sitting right now, with the people who've been elected by the people in the north. So I believe that we need to look back at what has been agreed and deal with, yes, this really difficult, very sensitive issue. But that's why, in particular, a unilateral approach here, I think, is not the optimum way forward.
Thank you both. We could spend
the
the entire time on this, but I appreciate both of your perspectives here. I would like to move to another sensitive issue, one perhaps a little further out, and that is the issue of constitutional change. Senator Mitchell, made the point that one of the brilliant components of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was the principle of consent. And recently, the whole question of the constitutional change and the potential for the island being united has come up, partially in the context of post-Brexit realities. And we have communities campaigning for different aspirations. And some people, some prominent people, thinking that perhaps there will be a united Ireland within this generation. I would like to just ask for both of your perspectives on this in terms of what's the appropriate role of governments in thinking about this potential, and what are the prospects you think for change and the role of your governments in any potential change. I'll start with you, Lord Kane, and then go to
Okay.
Mr.
I start from the Belfast Agreement, which is, sets out very clearly that there are two constitutional options for Northern Ireland. One is as part of the United Kingdom, the other is part of a united Ireland. There are no other options included in the agreement. It's one of those. And it's entirely a matter for the people of Northern Ireland to decide. The UK government currently sees no evidence that there is any substantial shift in support for a united Ireland. So under the agreement, the Secretary of State is obliged to call what's called a border poll in circumstances where he or she believes that a united Ireland is the likely outcome, has the discretion actually to call a border poll at any time under the legislation, but is obliged if the evidence suggests that there would be a united Ireland. We see no evidence of that, and therefore the circumstances that would require a border poll do not exist. I mean, so far as united Ireland I mean, obviously, nobody can ever predict the future. The current UK government's view is that we believe the best future for Northern Ireland is as part of a strong United Kingdom, but I fully accept other people will have a different view.
One of my favorite quotes in a completely different context is, "There are no facts about the future." So,
Sorry, I was in politics. You talked about 25 years and 25 days. It's sometimes difficult to predict 25 hours. So.
Exactly. Minister O'Brien, your thoughts on this?
I think I'd go back to something that another great Irishman and one of the architects of the Good Friday Agreement, the late John Hume, was talking about our focus has got to be on uniting our people. And really the shared island in that piece of ground that we all live on together. And really the aspirations that we would have, I think Lord Kane has outlined it. It's very clearly set out that it's an honest and just aspiration for people to have to want a united Ireland. It's also an honest and just aspiration for people to want to remain within the United Kingdom. I think colleagues here will know, and that the government and the people in the Republic of Ireland changed our constitution to reflect that. We changed Articles 2 and 3, which were that was a compromise voted for and accepted by the vast majority of people in the Republic of Ireland at the time. And that wasn't an easy decision in one respect, because there are many people in the Republic, myself included, who want to, who share views with regard to how, where I would love to see Ireland going. But I have many friends in other parties in the unionist community. And what's great in Ireland now is that, I look, my daughter's 15 and she has no idea. She drives up the road from where I live and crosses the border there's no difference. It doesn't seem like for kids of her generation there isn't. So, but really what it's important for is that our people, that we work towards that element of it, to making sure that the institutions that we have now are working for our people. But it is only an honest and just aspiration for people to have to see constitutional change. It's set out in the Good Friday Agreement as to how that would happen. But all of the work that's been done between the two governments by our colleagues in the North, and no less so by our friends here in America. I see Congressman Neil there as well, who've been all doing their best with, and all of us working together to improve a lot for our people, fundamentally that. So it's not just about lines on a map. And I think sometimes the discussion just about lines on a map, whilst important, don't get me wrong, leave the really important day-to-day issues aside, that we can be. I'm not even going to speculate as to what might happen in 20, 30, 40 years' time. What I'm interested in is what can happen between now and the end of this year, to make sure that the mandate that the people in the North have voted for is actually respected, that the Assembly can get back and sit again, that the Executive can be formed, that the North-South all-island bodies can work. And that's one of the things that my own government has been working through with colleagues, is like the Shared Island Initiative, to look at projects on the ground that we can help to fund by the Republic, over €1 billion, and excellent cross-community, cross-border projects that are there, tangible for people, that people can see that there is progress. And there's been real progress amongst people and amongst communities, over that 25 years. So it's now up to us as politicians and as people who are elected by our people to get on with that work, to take, yes, in some instances, difficult decisions, further compromise and move that forward. And there have been challenges, certainly, through Brexit. The Windsor framework is in place there. I think that's the way to move it forward. But I think sometimes speculation about what might happen in 30, 40 years' time doesn't help our lot right now here today.
I completely concur that the priority has to be to make the Belfast Good Friday Agreement work and get the institutions back up.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I will give you something optimistic and easy after those two issues.
Thank God.
And I'll start with you, Lord Kane, just going back and forth. And this is the question, you see this room filled with people who have been supportive of Northern Ireland. This has been a priority for Americans for a very long time. I'd like to hear from you both what you think the Americans might do to continue to stay involved, to continue to support the progress of society in Northern Ireland and in general.
Whenever I'm asked about US involvement, my mind goes back to the Conservative Party conference in 1992, when the then Secretary of State, Sir Patrick Mayhew, was approached by a young journalist from the Financial Times to be told that a chap called Governor Clinton had just announced that if he won the presidential election, he would appoint a special envoy to Northern Ireland. And any of you remember Sir Patrick? He was a rather patrician, old-fashioned Tory who rocked on his heels and said Northern Ireland needs a US envoy like it needs a hole in the head. I'm very pleased to say that his forebodings were never justified. And actually, from George, Richard, and now with Joe Kennedy, the support that we've had from the United States has been absolutely, and I see Representative Neil here as well, the support that Northern Ireland's had from the United States has been absolutely fantastic. And long may it continue. I think the imperative is, to listen, to understand, to acknowledge, that certain parties still have concerns about particular issues. If you can persuade in a particular way, fine. I also think, the work that Joseph Kennedy is doing on investment is absolutely crucial. Jobs, prosperity, make so many other issues far easier to deal with and to resolve. So I think, keep the interest, maintain the interest. It's very welcome. You do a great job. But I think the primary focus on investment and jobs and prosperity, is the way to go.
Thank you. Minister O'Brien, you get the last word here.
Oh, thank you. That doesn't often happen. But I think, look, all of us know here, sitting here in the Edward Kennedy Institute and here in Boston, like what America has done for Ireland, what Ireland has done for America, but what America and Ireland mean to each other. Our ties are centuries old. They run right through our families. It's not just about economics, and I'll turn to that in a moment, but they're part of what we are. I had the pleasure yesterday of meeting many Irish American groups here, and I've been in Boston many, many times over the years. And like talking to third, fourth, fifth generation Irish and more who are part of that wider Irish community. I don't see a difference between someone born on the island and someone who is part of our Irish community abroad. We're very lucky. That's a really positive strength that we have as a country and as a society. And it's been really, really positive over the decades, but particularly so over the last 25 years. Like I remember, we look at the work that Special Envoy Kennedy is doing. Incredible work in relation to investment in the North. But look what's happened in the Republic over 30, 40, 50 years, going right back to our former Taoiseach, Sean Lemass, foreign direct investment, the biggest investor being the United States. Ireland is actually the 8th, 9th biggest investor in the United States as well. It's a partnership approach and relationship, and one that will grow stronger. But frankly, we would not be where we are as a country, as an island, both in Northern Ireland and in the Republic, without the support, the help, the assistance, the friendship of America, of Irish America in particular, but many other people who didn't even draw lineage or ancestry from Ireland, who took their time and made Ireland a priority and stepped in as an honest broker. And the work that continues in the Congress and the Senate under Congressman Neil and his colleagues, but also President Biden. If you look at the importance that President Biden has put in Ireland, in Irish-British relations, in forging a way forward post-Brexit, but in making sure that we remain a peaceful and prosperous Ireland. And that goal and that prize is there for all of us. I think the Special Envoy Kennedy put it best there today. You look at the colossal advantage that the north of Ireland has with regard to unfettered access to the single market, whilst also, being part of the trading bloc of the United Kingdom. The potential for inward investment, for growth, for new jobs, for furthering in education, higher education, is something that we support in the Republic, but has been driven very much in such a positive way by the administration and our friends here in America. And long may that continue.
Thank you very much for both of those sentiments. I'd like to thank you both for a really thoughtful conversation about some difficult issues. Please join me in thanking Lord Kane and Minister O'Brien for being with us.
Thank you all so much for that. At the heart of the agreement is the parties of Northern Ireland, and we're honored to have the participation from representatives of those parties. I invite each of you to come forward now to the well here as the chairs are added. So take your time, actually. And our moderator for this august panel will be Charles Landau. He's a senior research associate and manager at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Mr. Landau also spent time in Northern Ireland in the Northern Ireland Executive. So I'll maybe stall here a little bit, but as we have take a few seconds to allow for the chairs and the microphones to be put in place in real time. What's that?
Will we argue over the chairs? That'd be a good start.
Oh, we're missing one here. Yeah. You can take mine.
So cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Would you mind holding? No. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no worries.
He's behind you.
I'm going to have a sneak question from behind the panel. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Adam, for the introduction, for the opportunity to be here. My name is Charles Landau. My honor to moderate a panel with very distinguished political leaders from across the spectrum in Northern Ireland. We have a hard act to follow in Senator Mitchell in the last discussion, but we'll do our best. We're in very good hands with this group, I know. And I also want to say it's a particular honor for me to be here, not only because of my interest in Northern Ireland and the privilege of being involved there, but also because I began my career as an aide to a U.S. senator, and it was during the time that Senator Kennedy served in the Senate, and I didn't get the chance to preside from the floor very much as a junior aide, so now I've really moved up in the world, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I don't want to spend too long on introductions so we can dive into our discussion, but I want to introduce each of our panelists very briefly. To my left here, just starting down the line, we have John Finucane from Sinn Féin, who's a member of Parliament from Belfast North, also a solicitor and former Lord Mayor of Belfast, among other posts. Right? Next to John, we have Colm Eastwood, leader of the Social Democratic and Labour Party, member of Parliament from the constituency of Foyle, and a former mayor, also a city councillor in Derry, or if you prefer, Londonderry.
No.
Call
it whatever you want.
Yeah. We have Mike Nesbitt of the Ulster Unionist Party, former leader of that party, currently a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly from Strangford. And Mike is a member of the Northern Ireland Policing Board, a former commissioner of the Victims and Survivors Service in Northern Ireland. Quite far away, but nice to see you. We have Andrew Muir. Andrew's from the Alliance Party, member of the Northern Ireland Assembly from North Down. Also, I believe, Chief Whip of the Alliance Party. He'll be coming around the chamber when we vote afterwards, so be ready. And Andrew was previously mayor of North Down, also local councillor. And finally, on the end, David Brooks from the Democratic Unionist Party, member of the Northern Ireland Assembly from East Belfast, and former member of the Belfast City Council. So thank you all again for being with us. I'd like to start with a bit of a look back over the 25 years since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And we'll try to just open with a general view. And I want to ask you all, both as political leaders, but as human beings, people who've grown up and lived in Northern Ireland, what strikes you the most about what the society has achieved over the past 25 years? But also, what areas do you think have fallen a bit short of the progress that you might have hoped in this era? Mike, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think the outstanding achievement was the end of the daily violence. And George Mitchell talked about 2,500 people losing their lives, 3,500 over 25 years. And I'm very conscious, I'm speaking in a country where you lost 3,000 in the single day, you know, was 9/11. So to give it some context, if you scale up what we went through on a pro rata per head basis, would you believe the number of dead in America for the same level of violence would be 700,000 people, about 12 times the number of Americans who lost their lives in Vietnam. So it is probably to be expected that we are still struggling to make our way through dealing with what we did to each other over that period of time. So that's a great achievement, Charlie. I think where we've come up short is in reconciliation. We don't even have an agreed definition of reconciliation amongst the parties. To me, it involves giving up all hope of creating a better past and thinking about creating a better future, getting back to that spirit of '98, which was all about building relationships between people who were traditional enemies, having that concept which David Trimble and John Hume understood of the greater good. And also, I think, delivering on something that we promised back in '98, which was called the peace dividend, which was an economic thing where we were saying to people, we're no longer spending millions on security, we can divert that into the economy and make your lives better. And far too many people haven't had a sniff of the peace dividend. So the next 25 years have to be about delivering that prosperity agenda, giving people agency and purchase in the process that we're involved in politically. And that's why I am so pleased to have Joe Kennedy, because he absolutely gets it. We have great levels of employment, but we also have really disturbing levels of people who are economically inactive. And again, I think Joe understands that that's where there has to be a focus, that if we're going to build a proper economy, it has to be truly inclusive. So I say to Mr. Kennedy, God bless you, and thank you very much for coming on this journey with us.
Thank you. Andrew.
First of all, I want to start by thanking you for the invite to be here today, and also to the people, the representatives of the United States of America and the support they've given to Northern Ireland and Ireland over the years. It's been immensely positive, and very much grateful for that, and especially in the latest endeavours of Joe Kennedy III. That is something that we're very, very grateful for. In terms of the last 25 years, Northern Ireland has changed beyond recognition over the last 25 years, and I'm enormously grateful for what we have in terms of relative peace. We can talk an awful lot about what more we should do, but we should recognise the achievements that have occurred over the last 25 years and what steps we've taken forward. There's a number of things we need to do better, one of which Mike's talked about, is about reconciliation. We're still a very divided society, and there's very difficult decisions we still have to take, such as, for example, in terms of education, and making integrated education the norm, in terms of housing, and also walking the walk rather than just talk the talk in terms of intolerant statements and attitudes, and that's something that's been particularly in the media of late. The other issue over the last 25 years is really social deprivation in terms of communities that have been left behind. We really redouble our efforts to ensure that no one is left behind and it is a truly inclusive society. Maybe the last one for me is that the social change that has occurred over the last 25 years, I've seen that as being notable. As a gay man, I know that the equality legislation that's been delivered in Northern Ireland has been entirely despite, but not due to the Assembly. And we need to be able to strive forward with a much more equal society, and it's something that's embraced and where the Assembly is seen to be championing and delivering that for all citizens in Northern Ireland. We'll no doubt come on to the fact that over the last 25 years we have 3 periods where the government hasn't been sitting, and I think the people of Northern Ireland deserve better than that. They deserve to have a government that is sitting and which is delivering for them all. But let's be clear, what's happened over the last 25 years has been positive, and the role of the United States of America has been immense, and for which I and so many people in Northern Ireland are grateful for.
Thank you, Andrew. A number of things there I want to continue circling back to during the conversation, but we'll go now to David.
Yes, I agree with many of the things that have already been said. I think there's no doubt that Northern Ireland society is in a better place now than it was 25 years ago. And that's due to the Good Friday Agreement and the subsequent agreement since, that we have been able to work together, both politically but also with the community. I'm slightly more positive, I think, than in terms of when we talk about reconciliation. I think we have to be realistic that Northern Ireland was a deeply divided society. I think we've come a lot further in those 25 years than perhaps other parts of the world that have faced similar struggles, and we have to give ourselves, I think, some recognition of that as a community. I think the younger generations are growing up more integrated and mixing more than probably ever before. I certainly have friends across the divide, of friends who were at my wedding when I got married from Colm's party. So across political divides, across community divides. Just give me their names. Yeah, I'll sort you out after. So in some ways, I think that's would have been probably less likely back in the day. So I think we do have to recognise that actually we have made progress and celebrate that progress. I think Andrew's right around there are some communities that feel that they're disillusioned with the peace process, that they feel left behind, and we have to work on that. And I also think there was good balance given to it today, but I do say, as a member of the party who opposed the Good Friday Agreement at the time, I think it's important to say and put on record that those who voted against the Good Friday Agreement weren't endorsing political violence as it can sometimes be framed. They were for peace like everyone else. My parents wanted peace and wanted me to grow up in a better society, but they also wanted justice. They wanted justice for victims who had lost people, who had family members murdered and had empty seats around the table. And that's difficult to give up. It's something that most civilized societies would not give up, and that's what they were being asked to do. It was a very difficult position for people to put in, and therefore I would say that those of us, or certainly those parties, and us being probably the primary one that opposed the Good Friday Agreement, did not do so on the basis of thinking that the society as it was okay, but rather because we felt it fell short in terms of justice.
Thank you, David. I appreciate having that perspective. That carries into issues that remain with us today, I think, in which we've heard a little bit about already, and we'll try to pick up on here too. But for now, please, over to John.
Thank you. And again, I want to extend my thanks to the Edward Kennedy Institute, the partners, the sponsors for today's event, which has really been a continuation of events that we've seen throughout this year, all over Ireland, in England, in Europe, and of course in America, celebrating, reflecting on our Good Friday Agreement. And of course we had that very spectacular event in Belfast earlier on this year, marking 25 years. And I think probably, like, for a lot of us, before maybe giving a political perspective, a lot of us will reflect personally. That's no different for me. In 1998 I was 18. The very first time I was able to cast my vote was in the Good Friday Agreement, and as somebody who was a teenager at that time, who had grown up through a very violent and conflicted 1980s and 1990s. I remember, even as I get older, and my memory sometimes isn't as sharp as it should be, but I remember even this year thinking back then that there was something different in the air in 1998. I know we've had a bit of a behind-the-curtain review by Senator Mitchell as to the frustrations that people in the room were facing, but I think after years of a process which was very much from the bottom up, we can sometimes forget that. It may not have been possible without the help of governments and people like Senator Mitchell and their calibre coming in. But this was a bottom-up process. Communities were involved, and in 1998 it did feel as if there was a potential, a hope, an optimism that certainly what we had grown up with could end. It could be replaced by something much better. And I think it is important, following on from comments so far on this panel and previous panels, that it is important before we start to correctly analyse what can be done better, we do sit back and recognise what has been done very well. I look at it as well through the eyes of my children. My two oldest are 19 and 20, and I look at the city that they have grown up in, and I'm very grateful that things that I can tell them is completely alien to their experience of what they've grown up with, the decisions that they make, the friends that they have, the places in Belfast that they could go. This might all sound like very simple, basic things that you would want to have your children or for yourself to grow up. We have that now, and I put that firmly at the door of the Good Friday Agreement. So it's important that we reflect on that and appreciate that. But the Good Friday Agreement, again, I'm probably stealing a lot of good lines from throughout this year. It wasn't necessarily a fixed moment in time. It wasn't a static instrument. It was something that was required to be cherished, to be nourished, to be protected. We've seen threats to the Good Friday Agreement over the last 25 years, but for me, what endures, and even what we've seen in recent election results back home this year and last year, is the overwhelming majority of people back home are committed to power sharing. They're committed to the central human rights elements of the Good Friday Agreement. They want the institutions back up and running. They're demanding that the institutions are back up and running. They want strong north-south structures. We embrace and we want strong east-west structures. And so for me, I do remain optimistic that that is, in the face of frustration at times, in the face of challenges where we can all do better and must do better, there is that recommitment again to the ideals and principles of the Good Friday Agreement.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Over to Colin.
Well, I suppose sitting here is a great reminder of the help that we got from the United States of America. The relationship that John Hume had with Ted Kennedy and many others was really key to getting us to where we ended up. I look around the room, I see people like Richie Neal, who's been a tremendous supporter of our peace process, continues to be, and is there when we need him. And we're very grateful to have Joe Kennedy now doing the job that he's doing, and he'll know that I'll say I'm looking forward to seeing you in Derry, Joe, because there's more to life than Belfast. And so we continue that great tradition of fighting hard for economic development, because as John Hume used to say, actually the best peace process is a job. Putting people to work, I think, is the best way to resolve some of our problems. But as a kid, I was 14, turned 15 during the referendum campaign in 1998. We were just filled with hope, you know, the sense that something was going to change, the opportunity that we had now to do politics in a democratic, peaceful way, which was kind of robbed of us for a long time. That was a feeling that I think was absolutely there at that moment. I actually feel a bit like that now. As frustrating as politics is in Northern Ireland, there is a great moment of change occurring. I mean, I feel like the conversation about the future is very, very live. And for me, it'll be about trying to convince people of the opportunity of a new Ireland, where all of our people can come together and be cherished, and where we can actually properly do reconciliation, because sometimes I think reconciliation has been a bit of a middle-class pursuit. It hasn't really got down into the ground in terms of where people are. So we're at a moment, I think, again, of great change and opportunity, and it does remind me of that period in 1998.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. Wide range of perspectives, wide range of issues raised that I would like to spend more time on. We'll try to move efficiently. I do want to talk a little about an issue that came up in the previous panel as well, because I think it's one of the most prominent in Northern Ireland today, which is dealing with the legacy of the past. And the bill that Lord Kane and Minister O'Brien discussed with Megan O'Sullivan, that bill is opposed, I believe, by all of the main parties in Northern Ireland. And I'm happy to hear your perspectives on it in general, but since I think we have some familiarity with each party's view, I want to ask you two specific questions, if I might, about the legacy issue. One is, what about Lord Kane's argument on the previous panel that regardless of what we might want, there's a question of what's realistic to deliver after this much time. That's the argument that Lord Kane has made on behalf of the government in London. Is there a response to that? And what would your preference be for an approach that you feel would better deliver for what the society needs? Those are my very focused, easy questions on this issue, if I may. Maybe we'll start with John this time and go down the line.
Okay. Yeah, so it's worth setting a little bit of context for where this Bill Now Act came from. Whenever our devolved institution was restored at the beginning of 2020, the British government made a political commitment that they would legislate for the Stormont House Agreement, something that had been sitting on the shelf for many years, and they committed to doing that within 100 days. And pretty much on the 100-day mark, they made this unilateral statement that they were quite significantly and dramatically departing from Stormont House and would take an approach that was born out of a Tory manifesto commitment, which was around the language of ending the witch hunt against British soldiers, meaning a claim that has been refuted quite dramatically by not a political party, but by our own police service and by our prosecutorial system. So it's incredibly frustrating, to put it mildly. The roll call as to who opposes this piece of legislation is very lengthy. It's every single political party outside of the English Tory party. The English Labour Party have committed to repealing it if and when they get into power next year. It doesn't command the support of any human rights organisation, NGO, any of our churches, even bipartisan opposition in this part of the Atlantic. But most importantly, the families do not want this. And I find it frustrating as well, and I find it incredibly unfair that the argument has been laid down before people as, well, what else can we do? The past is very difficult. I think with respect, that's not the question that's being asked. Everybody will understand that the past is difficult. And sometimes in this conversation, we can also focus on the criminal justice system. I haven't heard of a single family, whether their source of their loss is through Republican violence, loyalist violence, or state violence, who doesn't understand that trying to get a criminal prosecution sometimes 50 years later will be difficult. To remove that hope from them, I think, is cruel. But when we move into the civil arena, we have seen enormous success and satisfaction, for want of a better word, for families who have been through our coronial process. So I'm talking about inquests, I'm talking about civil cases and judicial reviews. And we saw one very high-profile example of that a couple of years ago now, with the Ballymurphy families of 10 loved ones whose relatives were killed over a couple of days in Belfast 50 years ago. And it reminded me of Bloody Sunday when they got that official acknowledgement that their loved ones were innocent. Because yes, it was about the families, it was important for them, but there was a cathartic effect on a community that had been vilified through the claims that their loved ones possibly deserved to be shot dead by on that occasion, British soldiers. And that was a process that worked. It was a process where our judiciary allowed time and resources. And with respect to Lord Kane's comments in the previous conversation, when he says what else can be done in the alternative, well, doing nothing would be better than this piece of legislation, because as we sit now, families who don't have their inquest finished by the early next year will have that inquest consumed by this new body against their will. It's a gross violation of their human rights, and we have already seen 12 families, I think, lodge proceedings in our High Court. The Irish Government has sought legal advice from the Attorney General, and there is a very real possibility, which I hope, unfortunately, that they take around an interstate case against the United Kingdom. And again, I heard this morning that our own Law Society had to cancel a conference about the legacy bill that I believe Lord Kane and Sir Declan Morgan were due to speak at this Friday. Such is the level of opposition against this. I'll finish on this point. This year has shown, on reflection, what works well during our peace process, post-Good Friday Agreement as well. And what works well is collaboration between the two governments in conjunction with the political parties. When it comes to legacy, when it comes to anything significant, a unilateral action in the face of universal opposition is doomed to failure, and it's very unfortunate, to say the least, for families who are passing this on generationally, that they now have this to deal with.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Colin.
I mean, well, this is not the first time the British government have tried this. Frankly, it's an attempt to whitewash what happened during very difficult days. I think the British government just want to close down access to truth. It's not about anything else. There's a pretense here that it's about giving families truth. This will not happen. It will not work. People will not engage with this process. There will be no truth offered to families. That's a reality, and the British government know that and know it very well. It isn't the case that they're trying to say we have to move on and all of that. The people who struggle with the past, the victims, the families, are people who are the most future-focused people I've ever met. They want to move forward, but you can't move forward by pretending it didn't happen. You can't reconcile a community by pretending the bad thing didn't occur. My view is you have to shine light into dark places. That's the best way for us to actually move forward. And we've had 25 years of not dealing with this. Has it worked? I don't think so. My view is we confront the ugliness of the past so that we don't do it again. This bill, if it gets implemented fully, this act now, I think will be really detrimental to properly reconciling our community.
Good, thank you. Mike, on to.
So you mentioned the concept of what is realistic in your question, Charles, and I think some of the most realistic people I have ever met are victims and survivors of the conflict. They understand that at this remove, which might be 30, 40, 50 years since the day they or their loved ones was hurt, the chances of truth and justice are extremely remote. Might be 1 million to 1, might be 5 million to 1. But here's the thing, there was a man in the early 1980s called John Proctor who went to visit his wife, a newborn baby, in a hospital. It was the last thing he ever did because he was shot dead in the car park as he was leaving. 32 years later, 32 years, a man was convicted of that murder. I will not look a victim in the eye and say, I deny you the right to hope that you are the next Proctor family. So you talk about what's the alternative? I think we could do things through the lens of human rights abuses, incident by incident across the entire period of what we so euphemistically call our troubles. And the thing about victims is, as Charles Dickens wrote in Great Expectations, there are memorable days in people's lives. And if you're lucky, a memorable day will wrap you in a chain of roses and gold. If you're unlucky, it'll wrap you in a chain of thorns. And that is what has happened to thousands of people over the course of our conflict. They have been wrapped in chains of thorns. And unfortunately, when they pass away, that chain gets handed down intergenerationally to their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. So what we need to do politically is to intervene and break those chains. And part of that involves delivering truth. Part of that involves delivering justice. But it also means delivering better mental health, because our rates of poor mental health are absolutely shocking. It means addressing social inclusion, family life, lost opportunities in education and employment, the full 9 yards of being a human being. And that truth and justice is only a part of it, because far from every victim and survivor wants truth and justice, but for those who do, it is almost compulsive. And this is not the way to do it.
Thank you. Andrew.
So for me, the ultimate measure of this legislation in its first few days is the fact that there's 16 separate legal challenges against this legislation, and that says quite a lot. It says quite a lot that this legislation united all 5 political parties in the North in opposition to it, and that also it is a unilateral action. What should we do? We should be victim-centred, and that's what the UK government hasn't done. It should get back to the way politics was done in Northern Ireland, which was when the UK and Irish government worked together and in partnership around this and other issues, and that it reevaluates where it's taken us to. This legislation passed a very tortuous journey within the Palace of Westminster, and many different occasions the government was warned about the implications associated with this. But to me, the most callous thing is that the implications upon victims and the hurt that this legislation is causing, and robbing them of what their aspirations were, particularly in terms of inquests, which are underway or just about to start, but are likely to be cut short. And I think that is wrong, and I really would urge the UK government, once this legislation has been passed into law, to listen again to the concerns that have been raised and not wait for these court cases to have to go to the courts, because the trauma and hurt that has been inflicted upon victims in Northern Ireland is so wrong.
Thank you. David.
Yeah, I think I agree with much of what's been said. I think, again, there are few civilised societies, if any, that would readily dispense with justice so easily, certainly not on the basis of it's going to be difficult. Therefore, this is the only way. I think some of the same victims groups that are being asked to carry the weight here are people who were asked to carry the weight at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. Were asked to make the sacrifice that should the people responsible for their families' murders be prosecuted, they would only serve 2 years, who watched others who had committed murders walk free from prisons, and now they're having justice written off. I don't think that's tolerable in a civilised society. I do think we, in listening to some of the feedback from the Irish government, should not be afraid to challenge the Irish government, that it has more to do on legacy and its experiences, and how elements of the IRA used the South as a safe haven at times. I think there's work to do there, and how their government interacted with paramilitary forces in the North as well. So I would suggest that there's more to do south of the border too. I think it is complex, because I think within unionist communities there has been frustration watching as there has been case after case where elderly British soldiers are brought to court, and I think that is not balanced by the same number of former paramilitaries being brought to courts, and that is what has been the heart of a lot of the frustration from the unionist community. And I think that's a lot to do with the fact that legitimate state forces like the British Army, like the RUC, will have kept records, will have records that can be produced now, and therefore can be brought forward in court. I think that that's not the same for paramilitary organisations and terrorist groups like the IRA or loyalist counterparts. They're not going to be coming forward with documentation that can lead to prosecution. And I think that the one-sidedness of the process has led to frustration, not just within unionist communities, but also within Great Britain. And I think it's the reaction in Great Britain, really, that the current Tory government is acting to try and stem. But I don't think the answer to that is to dispense with justice. I think any civilised society has to take that very seriously.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think it's been remarked in what I've read about the legacy bill that it's unusual to have all five parties in Northern Ireland agreeing on something, and I think that's true, and it's a measure of the opposition to the bill. But also in this range of answers, we've heard that not everyone has exactly the same lens on what they would like to see in this arena, and that's something I had the privilege to get to know in working on the issue too. And so we also see a diversity of perspectives, and something that makes the issue complex, but also I'm grateful that we have this range of voices here. So thank you all for your thoughts on that. And I want to stay with you, David, if I may, just to continue in the present before we then try to close with a little bit of looking ahead. But I do just want to give you a chance, David. It's been remarked so far this morning, the institutions have not been fully functioning in Belfast for various periods of time. It's not always been because of one party or one issue, but currently it is the DUP that has declined to nominate Deputy First Minister after the last election. And I want to give you a chance to give us your perspective on why you've made that decision and what the prospects are. And then I'd like to give you all a chance, just briefly, if we could, to talk about what the implications of this situation are, given the very daunting challenges on the agenda in Northern Ireland. So, David, you first, please. Thank you.
So I think when Senator George Mitchell addressed us earlier, he put great store in the Good Friday Agreement not being imposed from above, but rather being agreed by the parties, and those parties being representative of their communities. I think the protocol and now the Windsor framework has not been that. It has certainly been imposed from above. There is not one unionist member of the Northern Ireland Assembly who supported the protocol or indeed the Windsor framework. We all unionist representatives have misgivings now. I appreciate me and Mike and Mike's party will have differences in how we should approach those frustrations, but nevertheless it is right to say that there's not one unionist in the Assembly supports that, and it has been imposed upon us. I think recent polling has shown, and has shown consistently, that around 70% of unionists agree with the DUP position. I think that has probably been a frustration for the government, who wants to try and just bully and push, I think, unionists into back into the Stormont Assembly. But that Assembly can only function, and our institutions can only function, as we learned from the Good Friday Agreement, and as we have learned in the many years since, with the confidence of both communities. It is very clear at the moment that the Windsor framework, as it stands, does not command the confidence of the unionist community. And work has to be done to make sure that whenever we go back into Stormont, and whenever we re-establish, as I hope we do, re-establish the Assembly and the Executive, that it can command that confidence. So there's work to do. We are working with the government, but there's work to do for the British government in trying to convince unionists. In particular, I think that Stormont is the future for them. I think that's something that is becoming incredibly difficult, and the longer this goes on, I mean, we're frustrated just as any other party is frustrated with Stormont going down, but we will not be pushed back in without the concerns of unionists around the Windsor framework, both in terms of trade and economically, but also constitutionally, pushing us back into the executive. We want to be there, but it's important that we are able to give confidence to both communities.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, David. Maybe we'll continue with Andrew and coming down the line again on this question of how you see the implications of the situation today for dealing with issues on the agenda in Northern Ireland and potentially for the institutions as they were established, as we know, 25 years ago.
Thank you. As I outlined previously, we're now in the third period of collapse of the institutions at Stormont, and this third period is a matter of serious concern for myself. Public services are in a very dire state. We have the worst wait lists in the National Health Service throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. We have real challenges facing our communities, and yet we don't have any government. And my own view is that the basic entitlement for the people of Northern Ireland is to have a government. The frustration I have with this is that after the Assembly elections last year, a greater percentage of people, by a small margin, voted for the election of a Speaker and to get Stormont established than was in 1998 for the Good Friday Agreement. We have 20% of the MLAs at the Assembly who are designated as other, including the Alliance Party and myself. I do find frustration in that. I am very many different things, but I'm not just other. Back in 1998, it was just 7%. But yet we're such with a situation where we have these clear figures, but yet we're denied the ability to establish an Assembly and Executive. And I don't think this is sustainable much longer. And the idea that we can't reform the institutions when they've done that previously, such as, for example, in the St Andrews Agreement, beggars belief. The proposals that my party's put forward essentially is to ensure that Plan A, where the people of Northern Ireland are governed by their representatives, continues. And those parties who don't want to step forward and do the job have the opportunity to opt out. And I think we're fast coming to the position where that position and those recommendations need to be taken forward, because 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, people are losing faith with the institutions because they don't have the confidence that they're going to be sustainable in the long term, and we need to be able to step up and do those changes, because there's so much that can be achieved in Northern Ireland over the 25 years ahead. But the most basic thing is we need to have stable government. And I would say to the DUP, if the strategy is to continue to deny us a government, that's a very strange way to sell unionism. And I want them to reflect upon that.
Well, thank you. And we'll continue with Mike. I think we have a frank discussion on the panel, but I think that's very beneficial. Thank you.
So the lessons of history, to me, indicate that boycotting is never in unionism's best interest. Let's go to 1985. The British and Irish government signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Unionism didn't like it. What did? We took to the streets in huge numbers to protest. We boycotted government in London. And every unionist MP at Westminster resigned to force by-elections. The results? People went to jail. We lost every friend at Westminster and Whitehall. And we lost a seat at Westminster to Seamus Mallon of Column's Social Democratic and Labour Party, one of the most articulate advocates for constitutional change you could ever hope to meet. And the agreement stayed in place until we got into the negotiating table and talked it away in 1998. So it gives me no pleasure to say this, but the Democratic Unionist Party, as David says, takes a different view from my Ulster Unionist Party. In my assessment, over the last 25 years, every time there's been a big decision to make, the DUP have got it wrong. 1998, they were against the Belfast Agreement. 2016, they actively promoted Brexit, when to my mind it was clear, obvious, whatever Brexit meant for England, Scotland or Wales, it was going to be a disaster for Northern Ireland for the reasons we're still trying to work through 7 years after the vote. They trusted Boris Johnson, of all people, for goodness sake. Lauded him. And now, of course, they're bringing down the institutions, which to my mind is getting pretty close to an existential threat to Northern Ireland's future, because we cannot go on forever without those institutions. And the options available to the government in London are pretty limited. And I go back to 2016, and by the way, 2006, beg your pardon, 2006 was the only time the DUP really negotiated something, which was at St Andrews, changes to the Belfast Agreement, one of which means that Michelle O'Neill, the Northern leader of Sinn Féin, is First Minister designate. If they'd stuck with the arrangements of 1998, the DUP would be choosing our First Minister. But I say, what are the options? In 2006, it seems to me that the lady in Paisley was quietly told in London, it's your decision time, your place in history, and it will either be deciding to share power with Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin or joint authority by the British and Irish governments over Northern Ireland. And are we hurtling? Are we moving slowly in that direction onto that same territory? I fear we might be, and I really urge David and his colleagues, let's get back into Stormont. Let's show that we can make Northern Ireland work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Colin, if I may, I want to switch gears just for a minute here, because I think we're running very limited on time, and I want to be sure that we can have a round of comments that look a bit toward the future. So I apologize to you, and John, come to you first, if I may, with a final question. You're welcome to continue addressing this theme, but what I want to ask is something picking up on Senator Mitchell's remarks earlier this morning when he said that leaders in the previous era in Northern Ireland were trying to do what's right, even as they disagree on what's right. And so we have the question, obviously, of different views of how to govern the place today. We have the question of different views, different aspirations for the future status of Northern Ireland. But nonetheless, we have 5 parties and others besides in a diverse society that has changed demographically, that has changed with immigration, with trends affecting that society and this one and others. So a place that has a need to get on, and so despite, again, different views and quite legitimate views for the future. So I want to ask, how do you see this challenge of working together, of putting one foot in front of the other, given everything that we know about the differences that exist in the society, but also the progress that's been made? Let's start with Colm and John, and then we'll go back down. And thank you. Okay,
I don't like falling out in front of our friends, but I did listen very carefully to what David said, and I still don't know what the DUP want, to be very honest. What I do know is that a quarter of the population of Northern Ireland are on a health waiting list, and we have no government. And despite all your problems here, and sometimes I think we should be chairing peace processes on Capitol Hill, actually, but you tend to get the government going eventually, and I think Our first job should be to represent our constituents. We had an election 18 months ago. We now have also got the Windsor Framework, which allows us to trade on the same terms into the European market, into the British market, and around the world. It is a fantastic opportunity, actually, if you have any money to come and invest in Northern Ireland, in Derry in particular. But it is a fantastic opportunity, but the DUP still aren't going into government. And they don't want this imposed upon them. They said, it's a bit like Brexit, which was imposed upon the people of Northern Ireland against their will, and it's created all this trouble. My view is there is no future other than one where we work together. We've learned this lesson 1,000 times. We have to keep going back to the lessons of that great generation in 1998, where harder decisions were made, bigger sacrifices were made. You have to compromise every single day. My view is the future will be, in the next 10 years, is going to be a conversation about constitutional change. For me, we're going to be relentless in ensuring that that's a process of reconciliation, that it's not about victory of one side over the other, it's about bringing people together in a new type of country and society. I think that's where politics is moving. But we have to compromise every single day. We have to work together right now to deal with the issues of the health service and the economy. We can't do that by shouting at each other over a wall and closing our ears to what the other is saying. So I would just make an appeal to the DUP to come back in. We'll have our fights around the room, around the table. Let's not have them using megaphones. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. And if we haven't learnt that lesson by now, I don't know where we've been.
Microphones, not megaphones. Right?
Sorry, I can tell Colin what it is that unionism wants. Unionism wants the constitutional guarantee that was given to it as part of the Belfast Agreement, and wants that honoured. I have to say that what we're being asked to tolerate is a border within our own country, a border of for trading within our own country. Can you imagine what the reaction would be in America if Massachusetts was hived off, or Hawaii or Alaska had a border imposed that meant that it could not trade freely with the rest of the United States? Because that's what we're being asked to tolerate, whereby goods cannot freely flow both ways in terms of trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And I think that is an intolerable situation. And again, it's unionists in Northern Ireland being asked to accept something that would not be accepted by people in any other civilized country.
I mean, it's not true. Actually,
it is true.
I
want to make sure we broaden out, because we have a schedule. And I don't want to deprive anyone of a chance.
The constitutional guarantee, though, just to say this, I'm an Irish nationalist. I want to see constitutional change. I want to see United Ireland, but I don't have one. That will only happen when the majority of people in the north of Ireland, the majority of people in the south of Ireland vote for constitutional change. The constitutional guarantee is sacrosanct. It is there. It has not changed. So, I mean, I think it's important that we...
The Act of Union
John, let's go to John. David, please.
The Union has been altered. The constitutional position of Northern Ireland has changed.
David,
the courts have ruled that it has changed.
Okay.
They voted for Brexit.
I mean, I'll make this observation that when it comes to the concerns that unionism has had since Brexit, since the protocol, since the framework, I'll repeat the comment that I think it's line 1 of the protocol, which states that Northern Ireland's place is within the United Kingdom until such times as the people vote otherwise. That's repeated in the Windsor Framework. But what I think is a source of growing frustration for people is that those who you seek to punish as a result of this are those who didn't have a single thing to do with the agreement between the British government and the European Commission. There was not one single political party in the north who negotiated that agreement. There's not one single political party or member of the electorate that had anything to do with the agreement between the British government and the European Commission. But for those on waiting lists, for those who are struggling to feed their family and heat their homes as we enter into another winter of uncertainty with rising costs of energy, of food, cost of living, people on health waiting lists, schools in some cases crumbling around us, those are the people who look to us.
They were there when the Assembly was up as well, John.
Who look to R5, if I could finish, they look to the political parties to do the job that they were elected to do. Your MPs are still taking their seats. Your lords are still taking their seats.
You're not, of course.
And of course, I make that clear whenever I put myself there for election. That
As
wasn't
did we.
clear.
But
If I could finish, David, if I could finish, there is a punitive aspect to what is seen as an inability to commit to power sharing in a context where we've had 2 historical elections in the last 12 months. For the first time ever in the history of the jurisdiction, we now have a nationalist, the Republican, who should be in the role as First Minister. We have a Republican Party that's the biggest party in local government as well. I say that not with any sense of triumphalism, but as a reflection of the society that we live in, a society that is represented by multiple different parties, and the very least that our electorate deserve is to have those members of those parties working together, disagreeing in a healthy way when disagreements arise, but showing positive leadership to deliver, to demand the resources that we know we need back home to deliver for our constituents. And where I see things going forward, again, make no mistake about it, the conversation around constitutional change is at a level and has a pace that has never been seen before. We have the founding member of David's party, who in a recent interview a couple of weeks ago talked quite spectacularly and dramatically about what he saw was the inevitability of border polls. And there's nothing to fear from that, can I say? It's contained within the Good Friday Agreement. If you support democracy and support the Good Friday Agreement, you should support the managed and responsible way that this question will be put to the people north and south. I will advocate for constitutional change. I would never seek to patronise David to change his mind. That's not what this is about. He will sell the benefits of the union, and it will be for the people on the island to decide where they see their future. But make no mistake about it, academia, civic society, business, lots of different areas in our society are having this conversation, and I think the pace of change will only gather in the years ahead.
Thank you, John. And I think that's a good note to end. And with apologies to everyone, we could continue spending time, but I do think this question of constitutional change remains alive for sure, but in a peaceful context. In the context of discussions like this one is a testament to the power of the Edward Kennedy Institute to convene everyone here. We have a wide range of voices. I know we've benefited from hearing them, and it was my honor to be here. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for your insights and dedication. We now are at our final panel, and maybe we'll, as they're arranging, I appreciate you preparing yourselves to come down. As they're arranging, maybe I'll make one announcement. There's going to be an important opportunity to continue this conversation at an upcoming event at Boston College with the leading researchers of Queen's University Belfast next week, October 4th from 5 to 7 at the Connolly House. And their panel is entitled, Where Next for Northern Ireland? So that's another opportunity for all of us to continue speaking. Now, our final panel, please go ahead, take your seats, is entitled Opportunity, Prosperity, and Investing in the Future. The distinguished group of business leaders will be led in conversation by Jim Brett, another one who is a friend to many in this audience. He's the president and CEO of the New England Council, which is the nation's oldest regional business council, in fact turning 100 in a year or two, the Jim, I think. And so we are grateful for the council's sponsorship of this event today. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. And let me just begin by thanking the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for convening all of us here today, and in particular Adam Hines, when he told me back in the summer that he was able to put something like this together. Quite frankly, many of us were a little taken back, saying, how are you ever going to get Congressman Richie Neal, and how are you going to get Joe Kennedy, and how you're going to get George Mitchell, and then all of the distinguished panelists here on the same day, and he pulled it off. So kudos to Adam Hines and his extraordinary staff here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute. And as someone who has been with the New England Council for many years, as Adam alluded to, we are 98 years old. We are very interested in foreign policy, international trade, and our office is here in Boston as well as in Washington. It's federal policy that we are interested in advocating on behalf. So delighted to be here to moderate this discussion here with some very distinguished panelists. And they are Sharon Cunningham, the CEO, co-founder of Shola Oncology, a company that develops and commercializes medications to treat cancer. The company is headquarters in County Tipperary, but they also have an office here in Cambridge. Dr. Robert Ladner, CEO and founder of CV6 Therapeutics, a biotech firm that specializes in innovative therapeutics for cancer and inflammatory diseases. Steve Orr, Chief Executive Officer of Catalyst, an independent nonprofit science and technology hub focused on fostering innovation and entrepreneurship in Northern Ireland. Needless to say, we're honored to have them here today. Maybe we can just start by giving you all an opportunity to give a few minutes about your organizations, about your presence, both here in the United States and in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. So maybe we'll start with you, Sharon.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Jim. It's a privilege to be here today and delighted for the invitation, and thank you very much to the organisers. I co-founded Shola Oncology almost 6 years ago now in County Tipperary in Waterford, where we're still headquartered. And 2 years ago, I relocated to the US, opened our office in Cambridge here in Massachusetts, ahead of the first commercialization of our oncology portfolio. So earlier this year, in March, we received FDA approval for our first drug, a T-cell leukemia drug, and we subsequently launched it here in the US in May of this year. We're preparing to launch our second product later this year. It's been such a welcoming experience relocating here to Boston in particular, which is obviously the place to be if you're Irish in America. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jim.
Steve.
It is such a privilege to be here at the Edward Kennedy Institute. To better introduce myself, I'm going to take a little detour first, but I'm going to say something, and maybe this is a real minority view, but I have a lot of respect for Northern Irish politicians. Okay, I can sense the frustration that everybody feels, but as a citizen, they have the courage to try to solve a problem that for 1,000 years nobody's really been able to solve, and where progress has been able to be made. Catalyst was created as a Good Friday Agreement project. It was created as a project to help to create a peace dividend that could be realised for the people of Northern Ireland. As a citizen, I have great respect that there are very difficult problems that need to be solved, but I trust politically that the arc of Northern Ireland will bend towards progress, and it does, and it always has. As an independent non-profit organisation, what we do, what my role is to do, is just to create a platform for the people themselves to shine. And the one thing that I feel so passionately about, as an entrepreneur myself, I was an entrepreneur for 10 years in California in the technology sector, the one thing that the Good Friday Agreement has created an incredible legacy is the rise of entrepreneurship in Northern Ireland. So as a science and tech hub today, Catalyst is home to 140 companies, so some, including some iconic US companies like Qualcomm, IBM, Citigroup. We're home to the major scaling companies in Northern Ireland, and as a non-profit organisation we use the surplus profit that we generate, and we have done since 2007, to underwrite the creation of the startup ecosystem in Northern Ireland. So in the 12 months that's just finished, we will have had over 1,000 science and technology entrepreneurs engaged in our support programmes. And what we've seen, and what I'll come back to in a little bit, is just about the amazing success and the rise of entrepreneurship in Northern Ireland. But it's all been because of the relative tranquility, the relative peace that exists now to enable people with courage to take the step into entrepreneurship.
So my name is Robert Ladner. I'm the CEO of CV6 Therapeutics. As you can tell, I am not from Northern Ireland. I am from southern New Jersey. I want to give you my perspective. This is a very personal perspective, not driven by politics. I didn't grow up there, but it is driven by opportunity. And I see a very different Northern Ireland than some of the things I may have seen today. So I was a cancer researcher at Rutgers University and met a very important person named Patrick G. Johnston, who was at the National Cancer Institute. He was from Ireland, and we were both in the same area of cancer therapeutics. Patty then went on to become the Vice Chancellor of Queen's University, and we were longtime friends, and he was my mentor. And I kept showing him new data and new opportunity, and I said, we have an opportunity for real impact here. We have to develop this drug. How do we do it? And so he said, you're going to have to take some risks. And we raised capital out of the United States. At the time, the University of Southern California and California in that particular area wasn't suited. And he said, what about taking everybody and coming over to Northern Ireland? And so I took my entire research group, moved halfway around the world. We are now housed within Queen's University, which is a major actor in Northern Ireland. There's incredible people there. And we are now poised to put the first cancer drug ever developed out of Northern Ireland from the Patrick G. Johnston Center into patients in the beginning of next year. And that happened because of the 25th Good Friday Agreement. I have no doubt. I met Patty during the time when the Good Friday Agreement was actually happening, but coming over to Northern Ireland, there's some real reasons why, I'm staying there and completing what we're trying to do. So when I first arrived, you go to a taxi driver, and they'll ask you about your American accent, and where are you from? Well, I'm from California. What are you doing here? I just moved here with my whole research group. And they all turn around and say, why would you go and do something like that? It's very confusing to them. But let me tell you why. I lived in Santa Monica. I got 3 hours a day back just because I don't have to deal with the commute. All the people that I brought over from California have all stayed. Okay, so no poaching. Everybody is happy. The kids are in schools. They love the education is excellent there. And so these are those real tangible elements of everyday life in Northern Ireland that really make a difference. And it is affordable. And that translates to the business. And so from my perspective, and talking to the very accomplished folks that I brought over, we have a different view. We think that the future is very bright. The health science sector is growing. It's tangible. You can feel it. And we'll get on to some of these other topics, but I'm actually very hopeful and excited for the future, especially in these growing sectors.
I have a question here for Bob and Sharon. One thing that New England and Northern Ireland have in common is that each has become a global hub for technology and innovation. Tell us more about how our ecosystems in Northern Ireland and Ireland are supporting innovation.
Yeah, I might go first, and I'll probably focus more on the Republic of Ireland, given that that's where our headquarters is, but culturally very, very similar in terms of the entrepreneurial mindset in Ireland and the US, which means that the teams can collaborate very well across both sides of the Atlantic. Access to talent, quite similar in terms of educational background and so on. At times it probably is a bit more difficult in the US versus Ireland. Backgrounds then are slightly different in that manufacturing is a huge focus, particularly in our industry, in pharmaceutical in Ireland, where it is more of an R&D focus here. So it is very nice to have access to the different types of people and the different backgrounds that you might need. And then from a compliance perspective, I mean, Ireland's regulatory compliance record is world class, as it is here in Boston. So makes it very easy to work together and collaborate towards a common purpose.
Bob?
Yeah, I would say just a couple things. The talent pool is outstanding, and oftentimes I am talking to students in medical school or graduate school, and they always want to know, how do we compare to the students over at the University of Southern California? And I'm like, you're exactly the same. So The talent pool is there, for sure. The other thing are the institutions, whether it's Ulster University or Queen's University, they're incredibly entrepreneurial. I'm able to have an academic lab right next to a commercial enterprise within the institution. That's the way they think. And so the way that innovation is being brought into the universities, et cetera, again, is a major strength. And then you have things like Invest Northern Ireland, which is a government-based agency to help develop Northern Irish various sectors. And we've gotten 2 very large grants from them to support the clinical development. So there's elements of the ecosystem that have been built by design that are really distinguish this area.
You know, Joe Kennedy spoke this morning about Northern Ireland is bucking the global trend with increasing venture capital investment in tech and innovation. For you, Steve, what is driving that trend? What's the next global success story?
Just to put it all into some context, in 2006, 2007, I got lucky with my company. I thought I could surf every day for the rest of my life, and then I tried and got bored. But then I became obsessed with the story of San Diego and about how a region with a population of 1.8 million people, an economy 60% dependent on the public sector, this is in the mid-80s, and effectively an island on the edge of a continent with a mountain range around it, another country to the bottom of it, and an ocean to the other side of it, how it could go from the bottom to the top of every league table of indicators of innovative capacity, according to Michael Porter. And I got introduced to the people, that transformation was man-made, and I got introduced to them and the leaders behind it. And they, whenever I told them where I was, about how I would love to learn how they did it, and maybe move home and try to find a way to do the same thing in Northern Ireland, I was stunned that they said yes, and they said whatever help you need. So leaders like Mary Walshaw, Greg Horowitz in San Diego gave me 2 years of unlocked the ecosystem and helped me understand what became the origins of our entrepreneurship support in Northern Ireland. And the nutshell is this, and you see this very, very prevalent in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts today. It's the entire pay it forward culture. And so you have to create an independent platform that enables the most experienced, the most successful people to come back and help the most promising entrepreneurs pro bono to either accelerate their success or accelerate their failure, and then harness the network of networks of everybody to help them make the world a smaller place, to enable those entrepreneurs to get access to critical resources whenever they need it. Now, we started that in 2007, and I met a girl from Donegal. We moved back. We were like, okay, we're going to set up, we're going to figure out a way to do this. And Catalyst was the home that had been created with a purpose to do this. This is why we were able to reverse this into it. Now, we just said, look, we'll test this. We'll give it 3 years. If it doesn't work, we'll pack it in. But I was amazed at the reaction from the most experienced entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland, the most successful, all of the private sector firms. Whenever we said, look, guys, everybody needs to rise together to create the force to be the wind in the backs of our entrepreneurs here and to help them to do whatever we can. And what then became that commitment to pay it forward became quite overwhelming. Now, if you start that in 2007, right, I'm going to give some statistics on venture capital, and this is where this turns into a quiz show. So, anybody want to guess how much venture capital was invested in Northern Ireland in 2014? Yes, sir. 30,000? 300,000? Okay, it was going for pessimism, but not that pessimistic. All right, so believe it or not, £5 million was invested in venture capital in Northern Ireland in 2014. In 2021, we did 108 million. Okay, so we broke the 100 million, the back of 100 million. And then in 2022, a year later, whenever every region in Europe, apart from France, declined, Northern Ireland grew by another 29% to 138 million. Now, that number is a rounding error on the amount of venture capital invested in Massachusetts on an annual basis. But what this does show is our trajectory and our climb, okay? So if you go back to that 5 million that was invested in 2014, that was 250,000 seed rounds. So many of those companies that were part of that raise, and those much bigger rounds of 2021, raised their money then. And one of the things that you'll find, and I'm sure Bob will want to touch on, and the one thing that maybe we'll come back to in a minute about that is impressing people in Boston, is that our entrepreneurs are able to hit so many milestones in product development market development on so little capital. There's a resilience, there's a determination, and there's a bloody grit within them that we're on this trajectory. And I don't know if I'm going to break some news right now, but venture capital across the rest of the UK is 60% down year to date. Northern Ireland, we've just broken 100 million again year to date. So I'm hopeful that we're not just going to beat last year, that we could nudge closer to 200 million. But if anybody knows the venture capital markets, it's a cold, cold winter at the minute with valuations. So even if we just match last year, we're winning.
You know, at the same time here in the United States, many innovative companies are facing workforce shortages and struggling to find the right workers to fill the open positions and, you know, help them to continue to thrive. How are you finding the skilled workers that you need to grow the innovation economy?
Will I take that one? Yeah. So in our industry, it's actually the opposite in that, okay, so the biotech industry is in a bit of bother in that access to capital is limited or difficult at the moment. Valuations are down. Companies are letting a lot of people go. There's a lot of merging. And as a result of that, there is quite a pool of talent available that probably won't last, but just at the moment it is quite, you know, it's an employer's market in terms of access to the workforce. It's not the same in Ireland. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And so it is very, very competitive. But, you know, it goes like that, and it kind of switches, and, you know, 2 years ago it was the absolute opposite. So, you know, you just, luckily we operate on both sides, and some roles are interchangeable, and we can hire in each jurisdiction, so it works well that way.
Bob?
Yeah, so in Belfast, or in Northern Ireland in general, there's, at where we are right now, there's plenty of very highly skilled talent. But most importantly, we are integrating, educating the next generation of workers through the universities. So they're, again, a major actor in, there's plenty of people to work now, but I'm just as excited as the young people that are being trained in Northern Ireland. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
We've spoken so much about the Good Friday Agreement, but one of the many positive outcomes of the Good Friday Agreement over the past 25 years has been the emergence of an all-island community made up of businesses and industries that function as a cross-border entities. How can we continue to support a regionally balanced and integrated all-island economy and take advantage of it with Northern Ireland's unique access to both UK and the EU markets? Maybe Bob and Sharon again.
Yeah.
You want to get first crack at that, Sharon?
Yeah, I'm happy to
Please
go.
do.
Yeah.
Please do.
So for me, I'm fortunate enough to not remember much of the Troubles, so I you know, haven't known any different to what it is currently. However, since Brexit, you know, it has been very challenging for my company. It has slowed down my supply chain quite drastically in terms of the complexity, the time and the cost that it adds as a result of quality and regulatory challenges. And so in order to improve that and, you know, ensure that we can continue to work together, and, you know, several of our manufacturing facilities that we use are based in the UK, and we obviously want to maintain those relationships, but it is dependent upon government stepping in, helping alleviate some of those challenges, and regulatory authorities as well. And so that, you know, there isn't this slowdown. We're already under pressure in terms of getting our product to market, and the, you know, the time it takes. And so we can't afford for paperwork to slow down any further.
Yeah, and we're in the development, early development space, so we're not manufacturing yet. But certainly the way that I look at Ireland and the way it interplays, certainly manufactures a major strength of the south of the Republic. And up north, I would point it to, it's a center of innovation. So I think that there's a lot to say, at least in the one sector that we're talking about, which is the life sciences, that there's a lot of opportunity now that the laws have changed, and there's so much success that we see all around us. So I expect that to just continue.
Question for
Sorry,
you.
Jim, do you mind if I just come back on the talent piece? Because I think there's something really exciting developing in Northern Ireland. And so a number of the key institutions that was led by the Government Department for the Economy all formed one team. And the challenge was, let's rethink the long-term vision for the economy of Northern Ireland. And where we came out together was what's called 10X. So this 10X mindset for how we need to transform it. But the idea was that everything in the future is going to be centred around inclusive innovation. Okay? Northern Ireland used to lead the world in about 5 industries. We're going to lead the world again. Okay? We're going to focus narrowly on a couple of industries, healthcare, fintech, regtech. But this time, the opportunities that are created are going to be accessible to everybody and not just the meritocracy. Okay? We are all committed that we're all going to work that bit harder to make sure that the 50% of society that felt as if they've never belonged, you know, as Colm Eastwood said earlier, John Hume said, peace is about jobs. Yeah. So I just want to highlight a couple of initiatives that we have now started. So the biggest challenge facing tech companies or any science and tech company in Northern Ireland is getting access to talent. Right? So the value proposition of, look, we got a lot of available talent, that's good value, that's maxed out now. Okay? So what we're doing is we had the announcement back in April of an award from the International Fund for Ireland to Catalyst. So by 2027, we're going to prove that we're going to teach 1,000 kids furthest from opportunity the soft skills to innovate. Okay? Now, these are kids that are either in or on the fringes of the criminal justice system. And then we're going to prove that we can get them jobs in tech companies. Because that is not a problem to be solved. There's a magic opportunity there, and there's an incredible talent pool to be unlocked. And what we're already discovering is that there is an excess of empathy with young people from those backgrounds. It takes a different approach in how we have to nurture them and how we develop them, but how we can then bring them in to the fold. Now, and then we also have another initiative that we currently have about 1,000 entrepreneurs a year who engage in the support work that we do. But they arrive into the room and they're confident. Okay, we want to unlock another 1,000 entrepreneurs a year, again, who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, less privileged backgrounds, and much, much greater representation of female entrepreneurship. So we're raising a 10 million charitable endowment in order to fund in perpetuity to develop a partnership model with Bill Ollett at MIT, and how do we develop entrepreneurship for all at scale. So this is just getting way beyond the rhetoric of a commitment to inclusivity. Us, other institutions, and we're all working in collaboration on this and how we deliver these, because if ever there's a part of the world, and every part of the world does need this, because you do see two-tier societies that develop around advanced innovation-based economies, Northern Ireland needs this, and we are going to prove to the world that this is possible.
I'm reminded that we're down to just a few minutes to say the least, so let me end with a softball question for all of you. There are companies here in America, but more importantly, maybe here in this chamber, that might be looking to invest in Northern Ireland or Ireland. So what would be your best pitch to them to open up a shop in Northern Ireland or in Ireland? Sharon?
Yeah, sure. I think we've covered a lot of it already in terms of the access to the world-class talent pool, our compliance track record, etc. But one of the things that's often overlooked and people don't realise is the really favourable, I mean, I think it's well publicised, the corporation tax regime in Ireland is very favourable. But what people often don't realise is the R&D tax credit regime in Ireland. It's second to none, to be honest. The government effectively pay you in cash to carry out R&D in Ireland. And so if you can navigate that, it's a very, very effective, non-dilutive source of investment for your company. So I would highly recommend everybody to look into that. And location Ireland.
Steve?
So I'm going to answer this question by answering the last question you asked. Okay, so if you look at where Northern Ireland is today, we've got one heck of a foundation on which to build, right? Added on top of that, the UK government is investing over £1 billion into what's called the City Deal range of investments. Now, contained within about half of that are the creation of 8 new centres of excellence to expand capability and capacity in advanced research and innovation, okay, across Belfast, Derry, Coleraine, with some other places, but largely around healthcare and then advanced computing, really building on the capability we have in artificial intelligence and cyber, and then into advanced manufacturing as well. Now, you take that and then you add another dollop of the Windsor framework on top of that, and all of a sudden you've got a value proposition you can't find anywhere else in the world, okay? So if you think about it, so you've got companies that are located in New England who, so if you're only looking is just for talent, okay, we're maxed out too, so we're probably not the place to come to do that. But if you're in one of those sectors and you want to come to a place where we will make it easy for you to access partnerships, collaborative research and development partnerships, and we will co-design challenges, grand challenges that we want to solve with you that will ultimately benefit society, we will do that. We will curate the startup ecosystem for you. We will customize talent solutions for you, everything from 4th level down to how we can harness inclusivity initiatives. So Northern Ireland, and this is what's developing, and I mentioned this partnership between the institutions that's developing so positively in Northern Ireland, that we will deliver solutions for companies that you can't find in other parts of the world.
Bob?
And to continue from what Steve was saying, this is no longer aspirational. Companies have done this. We have done this. We brought the whole team over 8 years ago. We're successful. The resiliency of, like as you were alluding to, the capital efficiency and resiliency have played very well for the survival of our company during tough times with COVID, et cetera. So I think the other thing, the challenge to folks in the room is, I think there's a couple things. Number one, I have to convince investors all the time that Northern Ireland's stable. Actually, all the people that I brought over are super happy. Their quality of life is excellent. But we need more awareness of that sensibility to the investment community. And the one element is there are companies in Northern Ireland that we're at the point where we're maxing out local money, but we need to scale. And so my ask is access to capital to drive the companies that have been incubating there for some time. You know, come on over and take a look. I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised by what you see.
I think we're right on time now. I just want to thank the panelists for an upbeat and bullish discussion on the innovation economy in Northern Ireland as well as in Ireland. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Now, to provide our closing remarks, we have the privilege of hearing from Congressman Richard Neal of the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts. He is the dean of both the Massachusetts delegation and the New England delegation in Congress. He's also the at-large whip for House Democrats. He is the Democratic leader of the Friends of Ireland caucus, and he was also instrumentally involved in bringing about the Good Friday Agreement. Most importantly to me, as a former state senator here in Massachusetts, he was my congressman, which means I know how hard he works every single day for the people around him to make sure he's improving their lives in the district, in Massachusetts, and throughout the country, indeed the world. So, Congressman, the floor is yours.
So thanks to Senator Hines. He actually was a superb member of the Massachusetts State Senate and a good and loyal friend to me. Thanks to the EMK Institute, one of the privileges of a lifetime is the opportunity I've had to have served with Ted Kennedy. I thought he was one of the great legislators, as Senator Mitchell pointed out in his comments earlier. And I reread George Mitchell's speech that he had delivered in Belfast, where I was in the spring with him, as we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Agreement. It's probably not the best time for a member of Congress to be lecturing the world on democracy, given our own stalemate. But at the same time, I think we're reminded in a representative democracy like ours that foreign policy is heavily influenced by domestic policy, meaning that many times foreign policy is highlighted And I think oftentimes the ambitions and aspirations of people are exemplified in the manifestation of foreign policy. So I call attention to that because I think that one of the unusual parts of the Good Friday Agreement, and I'm going to talk about the brave people that are here today, one of the unusual parts of the Good Friday Agreement was it was the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement. And those of you who have been watching the PBS series Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, I'm stunned by the number of people who are in a sort of a confession mode saying, I wish I didn't do this, or I wish I didn't do that along the way, but they did it. And there were a series of issues that were taking place across the world that all of a sudden began to put Northern Ireland in the vanguard or in the forefront. You had the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the yoke of Marxism being taken from the necks of the people of Eastern Europe, and you had majoritarian government coming to South Africa. But all of a sudden there was still this very stubborn problem in the north of Ireland. And I call attention to that because it was the longest standing political dispute in the history of the Western world. And the significance of which is that 3,800 people during a 30-year period lost their lives. So let me give you some statistics that are pretty stubborn things. If we were sitting at the EMK Institute 30 years ago, there were 30,000 British soldiers in an area the size of our state of Connecticut. 106 military installations, and a policing agency that was not trusted by either tradition. A lot of times you'll hear people say they want to talk about the two communities. We will have succeeded when we are talking about two traditions in one community. And that ought to be the goal as we go forward, because once you reach your potential expands. So we await the institutions that have been accepted in an election in the North getting up and running, but not to miss the point that I think America was an honest broker along the way. We took great satisfaction in urging Bill Clinton to pick up the challenge that the State Department in America had resisted for decades. They didn't want to go near the issue. Where we had been an honest broker across the globe, there was this notion, I think, in UK circles, this was a matter that was internal to the UK. And I think that we took a position saying, well, wouldn't it be appropriate to accept the challenge in front of us and see if we might not help to establish a new day? So the genius of the Good Friday Agreement is essentially this. If you want to be succinct, if you want to be Irish, you can be Irish. If you want to be British, you can be British. And if you want to be Northern Irish, you can be Northern Irish. There is no threat to anybody's identity by what happened in the Good Friday Agreement. The argument instead is, in a representative democracy, which I highlighted earlier, you have to accept the results of the elections. And to get those governmental institutions up and running. So Minister O'Brien, he spoke earlier of a couple of very significant events that seem to have been pushed to the side. And they include the fact that to get to the success of the Good Friday Agreement, which was voted on by both traditions in both sides of the border by substantial margins, accepting that outcome is reality. So what happened? Well, first of all, the Irish government relinquished Articles 2 and 3 of its constitution, which laid claim to the 6 counties in the north. And the UK accepted responsibility by saying, we will now relinquish the border, which is a very important part of the agreement because it's known as Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, North-South cooperation. What I think is significant is we need to call attention to the great courage of the men and women who took great personal and political risks, and sometimes it included ending their careers, as to what brought about the new day. It would have been unimaginable for me in the late 70s to have ever thought I could welcome Dr. Paisley to the Capitol of the United States with Martin McGuinness. There were all of these it'll never happen moments that happened because of people on the ground who took I think, note of the time in which they lived, but also accepting of the fact that you couldn't continue with the militarized state in which people were living in. Through many, many meetings over decades, the Friends of Ireland, which is an honest broker, we encouraged, nurtured, and from time to time had difficult meetings with the Irish government and with the UK government. It wasn't always an easy path, given the fact that, let's be candid, Irish nationalism in America was sometimes more vigorous than Irish nationalism on the island. But we kept saying that there can be a new day, and the atrocities that we were all witnessing were that substantial. So back to that PBS series for just a couple of seconds. When you look at the galvanizing events that took place, including the hunger strikers, where I was just a young man on the Springfield City Council, and I signed up for the cause. And as time went on, I got to know people in both traditions. And I was impressed with the genuine sense they wanted a new day. And I look at some of the people that I've seen here today that have been longtime friends. That would not have been imagined all those years ago. But I also highlighted something that I think needs to be noted again. There was an election. You need to enter the government that the people have voted for. There are many elections in my life where I wake up the next morning and say, I can't believe the people did this. And then I say, guess what? There's going to be another election. And that'll be a chance for us to perhaps reset our argument. I spoke to Davy Irvine. I know his name came up tangentially this morning. And for those of you who don't know who Davy Irvine was, he was one of the hardest of the hard men in the Loyalist tradition. But he would always visit Washington, and we spoke one day, and I know it's 30 years ago because I can remember the room in which we spoke. And we were going on and on about some sort of esoteric issues, about what might happen, what if, and down the road. He's very calm, very nice, and very pleasant. And I've had a chance in the past few years to see his relatives again. But I said, well, what message would you offer to me, Davy? And he said the following. He said, if the nationalists will accept my majority today, I'll accept their majority tomorrow. Those were extraordinary words from somebody who, let's say, in the dark of night, did some pretty tough things. And I call attention to that because there are demographic changes that are occurring. The genius, again, of the Good Friday Agreement is it suggests that at the appropriate moment, the Secretary of State might call an election to determine whether those 6 counties in the north reside with the Republic of Ireland or with the desire to remain part of the UK. That's what democracy does. People get to make those decisions. It's within the crucible of politics that we find the way forward. Not always liking, perhaps, the outcome, but saying, well, this is what people voted for. We have to make it work. I also think that when you trace the concessions that everybody made to get to the Good Friday Agreement, you're reminded of this, which is central to democracy, and it's pervasive. Some of the hardest moments for the elected in the world, it's to say to your most ardent supporters, I disagree with you. It is really a hard thing to bring people along that have said, I held those signs for you, I was with you every step of the way, I helped make your career, and now you're telling me that what I want, you're not going to go along with. The better argument, perhaps, is to say, not yet. We're likely to get there, but not yet. And it's always easy in public life to be nice to people you agree with. Sometimes it requires being hard with people that have devoted a career to you and saying to them, the Good Friday Agreement isn't everything that everybody wanted. But nobody has ever talked in both traditions about going back to the way it was. I've not heard anybody suggest that we ought to return to the militarized state. Quick example that comes to mind for those of you who have visited recently. In 1989, I was on a congressional visit with the Speaker of the House, Tom Foley. I was pretty impressed he'd asked me to go. You know, I was just hoping that he would remember my name, never mind him asking me to be invited on this legislative trip. And we were going from Donegal to Derry. And at one of these military stops, with the Speaker of the House on the bus was boarded, with British soldiers with night gear, and they searched the bus with the Speaker of the House on it. Today, when you cross from Donegal to Derry, your phone pings. At a time when Irish money would not have been accepted in the North, today with the euro, even though it's not the currency of the UK, the publicans and others will say to you, I'll take the euro if you'll take the change with the pound. People on the ground have accepted this, and people genuinely wanted to move the argument forward. So it's in settings like this with people like you who have made the difference over all of these years. You've encouraged us. The stops with Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and George Mitchell highlighted the role that Bertie had played and others along the way, but never to miss the fact that the hardest men and women accepted the result of the Good Friday Agreement. And in America, I never give sustenance or encourage to anybody who suggests to me that we're going to put it aside, because we're not able to and we don't want to. Last point I'll make is that George Mitchell had the perfect temperament for resolving these thorny problems. He's one of the kindest, most gentle people I've met. We had a good series of laughs in the hallway about some of the people he met along the way. It's really informative to think of the fact that Mitchell could take these really hard personalities and get them to say, well, you might not love each other, but could we at least get you to like the agreement? And the privilege of my lifetime has been to get to know them again. And I just looked over to my left and I saw Eden Hume. I stayed at their home during those very difficult years. And again, at great peril, they took these risks. So to the people that are here today, who did these magnificent things, thanks and congratulations from the United States of America.
Well, that concludes our important conversation today. It's been a powerful set of insights, and we appreciate everyone for that at this critical moment and in our history and in our ongoing efforts. To everyone who attended here in person and online, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'll just say this, here at the Institute, we have events related to American democracy on October 5th with Pew Research data, and October 25th with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Please go online to visit us for those events as well. And thank you all. Have a wonderful day.